OTB AM. This is OTB Sports Radio.
It is 7:30 on this Wednesday morning. You are very welcome along to OTB AM. It's Eoin and Ger with you right the way through until 10 o'clock this morning. We've got a busy show lined up for you. We've got the return of the UFC coming up a little bit later on. Chuck Mindenhall will be with us chatting through the empty arena that saw the return of the UFC in Jacksonville over the course of the weekend. The OTB Culture Hall of Fame with Now TV in the company of Paul Howard later on. How's the head with Tipperary's Aisling McCarthy? But most importantly, Ger, we're picking Manchester United's best ever Premier League 11. The man Colm Boohig is putting himself in the firing line once again. Like, we've been watching the classic game. We've been watching United against Juventus 99 for the Classic Game Club this week. And I think we're going to disagree with a lot of what Colm Boohig is going to say this morning, as usual.
I think you could probably pick that starting 11 and, you know, shoehorn in maybe Rio Ferdinand and Cristiano Ronaldo, and everybody would be happy because that team played so well. That game was so spectacularly good. The first half of football is one of the most exciting halves of football that I can remember watching at the time. And then as you go back and see the end-to-end stuff, and just the way that the whole story evolves from Man United being 2-0 down after 10 minutes, essentially, to getting it back to 2-2 at halftime. It's a sensational game of football. It's
unbelievable. It's truly unbelievable. I don't want to blow what Colm is going to bring later on, but I dare say the front two is going to be the thing that's up for debate most. If you had a blank slate and you had two central attackers to put into your Manchester United all-time Premier League 11, who are you going for? Because like we've been basking in the glory of Cole and York all week.
Here's the thing, right? So if you take a full career, then you probably have to say Wayne Rooney needs to be somewhere in that team or near that team, and you can play loads of different formations if you put him in the team. If you're talking about impact on the club, then Cantona arriving and them suddenly being a title-winning team has to be in the conversation. But if you're purely talking about an absolute peak as a partnership, then what Cole and York were able to do, particularly in that game, I think this might be the high watermark of just how good they were and the telepathic understanding that they had of each other's movements and the interplay, and just how unmarkable they were in a range of different aspects, like for pace and power, for strength, for close control, for everything that you kind of forgot about these two as a pairing. Then I'd be shoehorning them into any team, and essentially into any Premier League team that you could have. Like, I understand that Thierry Henry and Alan Shearer would be, you know, a far better strike partnership in terms of goals and longevity of career and the impact they had, and they're far better players, right? But as a partnership, like, you see these two guys coming, like, oh God, what am I going to do here?
Like, absolutely telepathic on some occasions. I think the most important thing about this whole nostalgia boom is to actually make us forget about what happened in the Champions League for the last 2 years and actually go back to 21 years and realise that, you know what, it actually was as good as we saw last year and the year before, because I certainly got carried away saying football has definitely peaked when we saw Liverpool's comeback against Barcelona last year. And it is better, there's no question about it. But the levels of excitement and these crazy, mad games involving the best in the world did actually exist in the 90s. Who'd have thought it?
It's okay. Just explain why it's better, because I'm not sure that new is automatically better. So the players can run further, and they are a better level of fitness, and they've got access to better medicines. But why is it better now?
Because of those reasons. You are bringing it down to athleticism more than anything else. And maybe that actually does diminish the product, that you are depending on athletes a little bit more today than you would have been in the late 90s, I think. That pace is at a premium now. Like, it is the single most important attribute for a Premier League footballer now is pace. Whereas in 99, as we discovered this week, you can probably get away with not only being a little bit slow, but getting away with being injured in some games.
Zidane you're talking about, yeah?
Zidane, yeah.
How injured was he? I don't know how injured he was. What was the story?
He was quite injured, I think. Like, he was never quite right after the 98 World Cup for that season, obviously. And he was carrying in a knock throughout that entire season. But I just think that when you look at it now, it's unbelievably quick, wide play rather than slow build-up, deep cross, which was such a factor of the late 90s football, I thought. But like, is that?
No,
But maybe you're right. Maybe that isn't necessarily better. I just think that we have created almost robotic peak performance human beings at the moment that just fulfill systems. And in fairness, individuality does come out so much at various moments these days. But I just think that if you were athletically wanting in the 90s, you would have certainly been less found out than you would be today. And,
yeah, okay. Look, let's come back to this because I think it's an interesting topic. Where this is my favorite era of football to watch, and actually, whenever it's on Sky Sports, and there's an hour of that, those little hours that they do of football years. If it's around this period of time, I'm going to sit and watch it. But if it's like the middle of the last decade, I'm like, really, it's just a bunch of athletes chasing the ball and putting pressure on and hoping to find a mistake. But there's room for skill in this, and I certainly think this is a conversation worth delving into a little bit later on.
Absolutely. We will be chatting about that with Colm Boohig and Daniel Harris later on. That's coming up at around 20 to 9 this morning. Before that, as ever, at 8:15, we'll be kicking things off this morning with the sports pages. How's the head, as I mentioned, with Tipperary's Aisling McCarthy, and the OTB Culture Hall of Fame this morning with Paul Howard talking about Columbo. He's a Columbo superfan. And the UFC's return with Chuck Mindenhall of The Athletic, as I say, coming your way at 9:30. A rather bizarre atmosphere in Jacksonville at the weekend, where Bruce Buffer was roaring at the top of his lungs to 0 people in the audience, but a huge television audience all the same. So we'll be chatting to him about that later on. Before all that, though, as ever, let's get into our latest episode of our History of Sport series with Paul Rouse. Enjoy.
Because this kind of period where professionalism starts to really kick in, 1880 up to the First World War, it is in some respects remembered as a golden age for British sport. The Corinthian spirit is alive and well, but it's as professional and ruthless sounding as any other period in the sporting history that we're talking about.
It's an amazing thing. The people look back at this. It's an age of amateurism in one aspect of British sport, and the idealism that is put around it, and this notion of fair play and the Corinthian spirit, and the idea that sport is virtuous and has an honour unto itself. And the minute you scratch beneath the surface, you understand the extent to which it's rhetoric. There are obviously people who lived by that, and there were obviously people who believed in that. But there were very, very many more people who understood that it was entirely the opposite, and that manliness, which was trumpeted through Corinthian sport and Corinthian values, very quickly degenerated into brutality. And there's a great author, but people might have read him from the 19th century, Wilkie Collins, who wrote that what sport actually does not teach you virtue. It doesn't teach you honor. It doesn't teach you integrity. What it actually teaches you is how to take advantage and be ruthless of any weakness that the person you are facing into might hold, that you seek it and that you exploit it for your own end.
So things, to kind of expose some of the myths, there is crowd trouble, there is violence on the pitch, off the pitch, there is drug abuse, there is all the things, all the dirty ancillary aspects of sport are alive and well in this period as well.
Again, you look at Britain and Ireland, 2 islands united in one kingdom. It's the United Kingdom, and around the United Kingdom, these things were replicated. So gambling was everywhere. And with gambling came repeated kind of suggestions that there was match fixing. So there was match fixing stories in English soccer. There were match fixing stories in the GAA involved. Kildare were routinely charged with very little evidence, it should be said, of throwing matches, but that they were expected to win within the GAA. This notion of violence in sport was a massive riot in Scotland for Rangers and Celtic in 1905 or 1907, and there was a huge number of arrests, people very, very seriously injured. They had to bring in saliva testing for horses, because horses being brought in from America and from other words started to drug, and the horses didn't start to drug. Obviously, they were given the drugs, but it obviously had an impact in all of this. So as money pushed in and washed through these sporting organizations, people sought to prosper. This was people's livelihoods. People were trying to find a way to make money from sport, and also to win with glory, because with the it's one of those things, I suppose, about amateur sport is that the glory is in the medals. It's you don't get a paycheck at the end of the day, and for the amateur, those medals as wages can push people into positions. The amateur was far from being exempt from this world, and it's one of those things as well. From this period, you get the spurious notion of the divide between amateurism and professionalism, that professionalism became a synonym almost for competence and something being well run, whereas amateurism or amateur hour was seen as something that was shoddily run. And what we all know from even a modern appreciation of sport in Ireland, this is a nonsense, because there are professional administrators who have been proven singularly useless at doing their jobs, while there are very many amateur administrators across a whole range of sports who are brilliant. So that alone, it exposes that kind of notion of a divide between the two.
Okay, so then we touched on this in a few different ways. Talk to us about class, and you know, that fed into the rugby chat. Things like rowing is a good example of a point you want to make about class when it comes to sport and money.
Well, if you think about it, the divide between amateur and professionalism is miscast as you are one thing or another, as if there is an amateurism and a professionalism. What there are variations of both types of things. Within amateurism, there is the elitist amateurism of rugby union on the one hand, and a kind of a more pragmatic, loose version which the GAA has always employed. And then within professionalism, there are elite, highly paid athletes, and then there are semi-professionals who live or operate right on the margins of things. But as an example of the most extreme example of how sport was constructed in a way that fitted into class, you must look at rowing. So rowing was a massive sport in 19th century Britain and Ireland, and it was something that was dominated in the early 19th century by people who worked on the boats for a living. So, for example, there were 40,000 watermen, people who worked plying goods up and down the River Thames, working in the middle of London alone. And it was from those people working that you began to get competitions for various prizes. And to be the champion rower in England, who was a professional in the early 1900s, was a huge thing. It was the person who was the champion rower of England was a star. At the same time as those professional races were going on, rowing began to establish itself in the English public schools. So places like Eton and then later on Cambridge and Oxford had developed their own rowing tradition for the boys when there were schools where a river flowed through, or there was a river nearby, and they set up a racing tradition. You see it here with Royal College in Portora in Enniskillen, where a similar tradition existed. And from this tradition, you get the establishment of the boat race. Now, not the Oxford-Cambridge boat race. They called it the boat race. That gives you an idea of where they come from. And off that, the Henley Regatta. And the Henley Regatta is a triumph of class snobbery in the 19th century of epic proportions. So the rules around that, and of the Amateur Rowing Association that came out of that, excluded not just people who rowed for a living. So that is to say people who were watermen, because of course public school boys and the professionals who came from the public schools could not be expected to compete with somebody who rowed professional, at least in their own head. What they then did was they moved it on to being class. So you could not row at the Henley Regatta, this prestigious regatta, if you worked in and around boats, or if you did any manual labour for money or for wages, or if you had been by trade or employment a mechanic, an artisan, or a labourer, or engaged in any menial duty, or that you were a member of a boat or rowing club containing anyone liable for discrimination under any of those clauses. So, and this was applauded when this was introduced in the late 1870s and early 1880s. The Times newspaper in London applauded this, saying, with a kind of an editorial which it said, the outsiders, the artisans, the mechanics, and such like troublesome persons can have no place found for them. To keep them out is a thing desirable on every account. So this is clear. This may be dressed up. Amateurism may be dressed up as nobility, dressed up as something that kind of takes money out of sport. But in the case of rowing, it is an absolute example of class snobbery and class privilege.
Okay. I have two last points to hit on. I want to finish on GAA and why that stayed amateur, but just to round up the basic threads and themes we've been talking about. The models you've outlined there are fairly recognizable really up until quite recently in terms of the money washing around in sport. I mean, the salary cap in football has not gone that long, I suppose, and Jimmy Hill and the Players Union and all that. And really, up until maybe even mid 1980s or certainly early 1980s, take football as the example, top flight footballers, they weren't earning multiples of what the man in the street was earning. They were earning good money. And we've had this almost exponential growth in the last 30 years, and even more so again in the last 15, 20 years. It's just gone absolutely nuts. We're on the precipice of something. Is it going to keep going and more money, and it's just an endlessly phenomenal industry, and it's just immune to the normal rigors of the economy, and it'll get bigger and bigger and bigger and more money? Or is it almost reaching a point where we could have some massive implosion?
Is the current model, the explosion in the amount of money in sport is absolutely driven by pay TV.
Yeah.
It's absolutely driven by the fact that you can open out a sport and sell it, wrap it up as a product and sell it not just to somebody who walks through a gate or somebody who buys a jersey, although you keep doing those things, and you can sell a whole amount of commercial products around the fact that you can watch on TV pretty much everything that is available now in any given sport, anywhere in the world. You can see it. You can buy a subscription to it between internet-based technologies or pay TV channels themselves. So sporting organizations have tapped in to this democratization of access to communications. So there's nothing you cannot sell. The means are there to sell it now once you put the technology in place to do it. And it's all about models of scale. So if you're the NBA in America and you begin to sell your app where you can watch every live NBA game on any given night when it's on, and you can sell it to not just the market in America or not just the local market of a team, but the people all around the world, and you go into 8-9 billion people, that's a huge market to build it out. And because you manage to sell a subscription to that channel, you also manage to get a market for merchandising. And you see people wearing LeBron James jerseys on every continent, and so on. And he's just one example, and that's just one sport as an example. But amateurism and professionalism and where the money goes within a sport is absolutely essential to understanding it. So where does the money now in soccer go, and where does it always go? Well, the interesting thing about soccer is that it has always been a business that has ruined people as well as made people money. It's a very peculiar business. Normally, the nature of business is that you must utterly destroy your competition. You must, if you're Lidl, you want there just to be Lidl stores around Ireland, because then you obviously have a captive market and you do that. But sport can't work like that. You need for your competitors to thrive to a certain extent, at least, for sport to work. And sport has an unbelievable capacity to make people get rid of their money, whether that's through gambling or through buying merchandising or subscribing to things or owning teams. Look at the amount of money that oligarchs spend on English soccer teams. Now, you may say they get this money back and they do certain ones and that they have plenty of it and it's not a loss to them. Well, I would say that Abramovich has spent a huge amount of money on Chelsea. I would say that the cost of running Manchester City is enormous. It may be that this is a drop in the ocean to these people, but the point is made that this is not a business that makes money for those people. And it's a peculiar business to look at when you look at soccer. So when you look at a model, when you ask the question of whether a model can sustain itself or not, you must always remember that for all that there are people who make money out of sport, there are a lot of people who put money into sport because they have it to put in. So it's not a straightforward model of something exploding.
Well, it'll be interesting to see the coming decades, because what we've seen in the last 10, 20 years is a kind of exponential leap, isn't it?
Yes, we have seen an exponential leap, and we've seen change, and it may be that it has reached a tipping point, and it may be that the world just turns in on itself. And if you doubt that like our model of sport is essentially something that has developed over 150, 200 years.
Yeah.
And it may change again, and very easily. And if you doubt that, look at the Colosseum in Rome. You could not have imagined, if you were in Rome for several hundred years at the beginning of the 2 millenniums ago, you could not have imagined a world where the Colosseum of Rome and the great Roman Empire would not have been in existence, would not have been a focal point for that particular type of sport, cruel and all as it was, or barbaric as it was. You could not have imagined that. But we grew out of it eventually, and similarly, there is no guarantee. I suppose the great guarantee is that the world of sport will change. It's not that people won't play. People have always played. The question is how they play.
Yeah. The one thing that can't expand is time. There's still 7 days in the week, 24 hours in the day, and people only have 2 eyes. They can only watch so much. They can only consume so much. And I think people are increasingly becoming a bit saturated by the amount that's on TV. There's no room for much more. The only way you can make more money is if people start paying more for it, I suppose, or there's more efficient ways of distributing it and making money and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, already the Sky Sports model feels like it's coming to an end.
Yeah, I suppose I'm really wary about saying that, because people said in the 1930s, 1920s, the arrival of radio would kill newspapers. They said in the 1960s and 1970s, the arrival of television would kill radio, and so on. All of these things can find a way of reinventing themselves and moving along. And I think you have to be cautious about writing off a model that does just that. And I do take the point that one person can only watch a certain amount, but there are more and more people around the world on any day, and the manner in which the market has changed by a kind of a globalization of sporting access is really important to look at when it comes to the commercialization of sport, and that is what has driven them.
Yeah. Anyway, that's a massive tangent, but we'll see. We'll talk in a couple of years when BT and Sky are bidding again for the Premier League. It's hard to imagine they can still fork out what they're forking out. To finish then, the GAA didn't go professional, obviously. So why not? Was it ever close to doing so? Were there people who felt it should?
Well, the broader sense of, it's sometimes misunderstood that the GAA's amateurism is somehow a kind of a mutant version of the amateurism of elite English society, and that the GAA took this on, and that it's actually a vestige of Englishness, which is manifest through the GAA, and that just doesn't hold water. If you look at the reason why the GAA didn't professionalize in the beginning, it roots itself around a couple of key facts. First of all, what the GAA envisaged was a ball-based participation sports network. That's how it saw itself. Soccer, as it did, it became very quickly, it became a spectator-based sport, where elite players went into that. Yes, it is true that there were huge numbers of participants outside it, but the model was pushed towards this idea of broad-based or of professional sports where people would compete at that level. So the GAA was interested in broad-based participation sports. It doesn't mean that they didn't want people at matches, but it wasn't the motivation factor at the beginning. Second of all, there was the practicality of how it might work. Professional sports thrived in the conurbations of northern England. It thrived then in and around London. It thrived in the American cities, in these vast, developing, industrializing urban contexts. Mm-hmm. The market in Ireland is so much smaller. The number of people in the country was falling every year, not growing. The number of people who worked in industry was hugely smaller on a percentage basis than it was in either England or America. So the size of the market was a huge impediment to any idea of professionalization, number one. Number two, the structure of the GAA was also an impediment to professionalization, even if some had wished to do it. This very fact early that there would be a club scene and a county scene, created the fact that it was territory based.
Yeah.
Meant it took away the idea of a transfer market in large measure, number one. And number two, the fact that in the longer run, the fact that there are clubs and counties operating on the same level is really important, because it means that I think that if there was no county system and it was just clubs representing places, there would be semi-professionalism at least in Ireland at the moment. I think of the manner in which it has operated with clubs coming together and forming counties, that it has just impeded that sense that there would be professionalism. Number 3, there's a rhetoric of anti-Englishness. And this was wrapped around all of this. This was the idea that if you were a professional and you played the professional sports of soccer, that you're English. And if you sought money to play, that we didn't do that. We were in this for something different. We were in this for nationalism. We believed in the GAA as a project of national liberation, was how it was presented. So therefore, now this is the rhetoric that was spun around it. It's not entirely convincing.
Sure.
But this was the idea that if you took the Saxon shilling, that's what professionals did. But we played for the glory of the parish. We played for the glory of the county. And we played ultimately for the idea of Ireland. And that created a different atmosphere around these things. So it's rhetorical, it's practical, and it's about the aim of the GAA as a broad-based community organisation. So those are the 3 basic factors. And I would personally say that it is the practicalities of the market in terms of what's capable, in terms of the size of the country and the structure of the GAA, which is the greatest impediment, not the only, or the greatest reason for amateurism beyond it. And you must remember that it's well into its decades. It's well into the 20th century before the GAA defines what it means by amateurism. It's just kind of something that's understood. And within that space, a whole load of things happened which go against the idea of amateurism, the strict amateurism in Britain. So rugby union won't give expenses to GAA or to rugby players when they're playing games, because that's not what amateurs should get. The GAA did give expenses. Actually, V.S. Pritchett, the English novelist, says that the greatest word in the English language was expenses, because expenses allowed you to cover to a multitude the payment of cash to people. And I think we still see that, and see it in spades. Number 2, so the GAA paid expenses to its players, not always particularly well, often appallingly poorly, and left people short. But the GAA conceded on this idea that it would do this from the start. Gambling. There was gambling all around Gaelic games, and there were stories of players throwing matches and players buying matches, and this was always there in the background. Number 3, the GAA decided it would pay officials. Initially, it paid various secretaries in certain areas honorariums, and it just giving them some money during the year. But that quickly became a kind of by the early 1900s, you had a permanent secretary based in Croke Park, and that has mushroomed over the years. When the GAA players went on tours, they were given money. They were given per diems. But more than that, unlike in rugby, when the GAA players went into collective training in the late 1900s, before around 1910 and then 1912, 1914, people were paid money to cover for their absence from work. So the Laois players, when they won the 1915 All-Ireland, went for 3 weeks. They had the joy of spending 3 weeks living in Portlaoise or Marlborough, as it was then, and workers were put in their places and they were given expenses for their trip. And there was a huge fundraising endeavour to support this. By the 1940s and 1950s, until it was banned, teams could be spending between either 2 and 6 weeks in camp, for which they were given expenses, and for which expenses were people were put into their work, because they had to be covered. Also, there were examples of GAA players such as Tyler Mackey in Limerick having testimonials played in their honour. The person who has written most brilliantly about this is Donald McAnallen, who is kind of laid out in an article he wrote about 10 years ago. Just examples of how all of this was happening. And then when players went to America and played in America, there was, of course, no pretense around anything other than you're getting a match fee.
Yeah.
If you're a star player, you're getting paid to pay for a professional club, and there's gambling and drinking around those games. And the key, though, is there were 2 further issues that probably kind of shaped the nature of the amateurism that was put in place. Number 1, it was the use of the money to build a network of clubs. So the idea was that the GAA teams would play tournament matches and raise money, and that money would be used to build grounds for players, and sometimes to build churches or build schools, whatever. It was going into a community-based thing. Whereas in its competitor sports, money was often disappearing into pockets. Number two, officials who were themselves almost all volunteers, who gave their time to run clubs and who gave their time to run counties, were not being paid. There was a very, very small cadre of professional people working for Park. But beyond that, for decades, all around Ireland, volunteerism in officialdom was and remains almost essentially volunteer. And in a broad-based community organisation, why should you privilege one group above the others was the argument that was produced.
Mm. Okay, very interesting. I'm not going to get you started on Sky Sports and the GAA just on this.
I'm not allowed to talk about that anymore. I'm not allowed to talk. I've given commitments.
I don't doubt it. Signed contracts, I'd say.
Yeah.
Well, listen, that was week 7. It was fascinating. Paul Rice, thanks so much. We'll see you next week.
My pleasure, Joe. Thank you.
OTB AM on OTB Sports Radio, Ireland's first and only sports radio station.
OTB's Mount Rushmore. 32 counties. One county representative choosing their sporting Mount Rushmore. Some decisions are easy.
I mean, it takes 2.5 days to read Johnny Mutta's Wikipedia. It goes on and on and on.
Others are controversial.
Colossus of a man. But should he go up on the side of a mountain? No, Tommy, no. I cannot have Graham Geraghty.
Join the debate across all our social channels at Off the Ball.
It's very, very special, believe me. And you can say it's grand. It's not grand if you're not on it, though. Unfortunately, inside me, that's ultra competitive and I need to be there.
And catch the live decision-making over the next few months on OTB AM, live every weekday at 7:30 AM on OTB Sports Radio.
OTB AM.
You're welcome back. It is 2 minutes past 8. You've been listening to Paul Rouse in conversation with Joe Malloy. The full conversation available on youtube.com/off the ball. Now, a couple of years ago, you might have been familiar with the birth of a famous new slot on Off the Ball. There was an Off the Ball roadshow. Ger was in conversation with Warren Gatland and he dished the dirt on his relationship with Sean O'Brien. At that moment, Ger delivered the now iconic phrase, "The beef is real," screaming it at the top of his lungs, and we had the birth of a brand new slot. But never did we think The Beef is Real would reach such momentous moments like we have this morning. What is happening, Ger?
Forget your Dickie Rock versus Johnny Logan. Forget your Chrissy Teigen versus whoever she's up against. It's Boohig versus Kieran Cunningham.
Friend of the show, Kieran Cunningham of the Irish Daily Star. What's happened for people who haven't been following?
Well, I guess this all started when Sean Cavanagh spoke about the 6 counties, the occupied territories, or Northern Ireland, depending on how you speak about these things, as being part of the UK. Up here in the UK, I think was the fairly anodyne phrase he used to talk about how the situation is different because obviously, you know, there's a partitioned situation on the island. That part of the island has a very heavily influence from the Westminster government in London, who set a lot of policies when it comes to comings and goings, particularly in the time of a global pandemic. And this obviously led to a lot of discussion about the correct use of the language. Some of that was in measured tones, saying, well, you know, I mean, perhaps we all need to listen to what he's saying, and perhaps we need to talk to reach out across the barricades to other people of a different persuasion. And then some of it was fairly out there. I think was the word traitor used in some dispatches. And then Boohig was one of those people who tweeted in an angry fashion about it, citing the infamous Brawley, "You can forget about him as a man," which was obviously about a thing on the field of play as opposed to something he said off the field. And then Kieran Cunningham, 24 hours later, tweeted 24 hours ago, "I'd never heard of Boohig," and at which point Buff's heckles were raised. And he came after Kieran Cunningham using some of his more famous phrases like delete, 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 and some of the rest of them, which I'm not going to lie, I haven't followed the etymology of Buff's language and his patois, and so I didn't know the rest of them. But the Buff bots were out in force.
That's for sure. Boohig is the opposite of Tyler Durden. The first rule of Buff Club is you absolutely do talk about Buff, and he definitely does exist. And you don't say that you hadn't heard of him or he wasn't on your radar before. I should say we've just tweeted off the Off the Ball AM account. In the interest of burying the beef, we've reached out to both Buff and Kieran to join us on OTB AM. Our aim is to reach a shared understanding of the future of all communities on this island, both pro and anti-Buff factions. Live until 10 a.m. Says the tweet, and we echo that. We echo that. We just want to bring a shared understanding. But I have a confession to make as well this morning. It won't be a confession to you, Ger. You've been abhorred by my behaviour on the show in the past. But when we were doing our World Cup of Ireland's greatest sporting moments of the last decade, what was it, last December at this point, I hit a new low when I mistakenly referred to Shane Lowry's success at the Open last year as one of Ireland's great successes abroad. It was an absolute embarrassment. A couple of weeks ago, I doubled down on my political stance when I accidentally referred to the Belfast director of the Lake commercial as a foreign director. My GEA season ticket has been taken off me. Any tricolour I've ever been pictured with, those photos have now been burnt, and I will now be kicked out of this country, probably up there into the UK at some point in the near future. And
are you happy with that? Is that actually, you're going back to your own people? Is that like, going home in some aspects for you, Eoin?
Well, my entire life is just some sort of imperialism on behalf of Her Majesty, and that's what I do. That's what I do for a living here. But this is we should obviously rename this to The Buff is Real rather than The Beef is Real for this sort of slot. But from Warren Gatland versus Sean O'Brien to Buff Egan versus Kieran Cunningham, this is a lockdown beef. But I want to see who comes out on top. I can't imagine there are any correct way of dealing with the Buff Egan bots, the Buff bots as you put them, when they come crawling into your timeline.
Delete, I believe is the correct phrase, right? It's like that mute button is there for a reason.
Absolutely, it is. Tweet us at Off the Ball if you've got any opinions on this brand new beef, which will be coming back to, I dare say, over the course of the next couple of hours on OTB AM. We are with you until 10 o'clock this morning. Coming up, as we said earlier on, we've got the best ever Man United Premier League 11, Colm Boohig versus Daniel Harris, which has sparked a bit of debate. The other thing, Ger, across some of the papers is just about the Bundesliga return, about football's return in general. €19 is how much it will cost you to put a cardboard U in the stands at Borussia Mönchengladbach this weekend for the Bundesliga. They had a few cardboard cutouts for their last game, which was held behind closed doors, and expect to have 12,000 cardboard cutouts of fans so far. Would you part with €19 for this?
This is obviously a fundraiser for the clubs, right? It's a way for you to show your support for the club in this difficult time. I suspect if you're a Bundesliga fan, then are they one of the clubs where you actually own part of the club if you're the fan? So this is just a way of them kind of giving you something back in return for your hard-earned cash. Personally, I can't see myself buying a piece of cardboard for a Bundesliga game, but if I was asked to buy one for the Italian football club or whatever, then I can see why you would do that, I also see why it's a ludicrous looking thing, and people are going to make fun of this on the internet and go, this is ridiculous. But any port in the storm, I believe, is the phrase that I've been reaching for over the last 3 months here, Eoin. And this is the storm, and that looks like a nice cardboard cutout shaped port.
Shane Hannon, very good morning to you. Have you ever heard of Buff Egan?
I have heard of Buff Egan. There's a bit of Buff stew going on, is there? It's quite controversial, this. That was horrific, I'm sorry. No, I saw Kieran tweeting yesterday. I had been aware of Buff Egan. Coincidentally, I only followed Buff Egan on Twitter, on Instagram about 3 days ago. I had heard of him beforehand, though. I realised he was this kind of, I guess you call him a GA character who goes to matches and commentates on matches from the stands and has his own take on Gaelic games. But yeah, he's quite an interesting guy.
I think, in fairness, there has been a spotlight shone on lower tier hurling and club hurling, especially in places like Kerry, where you wouldn't often get, good televised matches and stuff like that, which people have been mentioning the last couple of days. How can you not have known about this guy? If you know anything about Kerry hurling or anything like that, or lower tier hurling, you know about this guy. So, yeah. So you only discovered him this week.
Yeah, I'd been firmly aware of his existence and had actually seen him at a couple of Kerry games before, but never had the nerve to go up and, never meet your heroes and all that. But he seems like quite an interesting guy. And as you said, look, if he's increasing interest in some smaller level games or lower tier action, then what harm does it cause? And we need a bit of GA beef as well, I think. I mean, there's not enough aggro. I mean, we used to have days where.
What harm does it cause? Does Barstool Republicanism really serve the future of the island well? Is it actually all harmless fun when, I don't know. I mean, look, it's important that this political viewpoint is aired so we can talk about it and tease it out. But I'm just not sure that, it's like you build up this massive following for one thing and then you do this other thing and it's like, oh, okay. So if I go what you're saying, and I like to get Sean on second and third tier hurling, and it's great. It's got a cult following, and then you become a kind of a leader in that community, and then you use that leadership to propagate a viewpoint, which, I think that the Good Friday Agreement gave us a direction to head in, where we were all going to recognize that everybody had a right to coexist on the island without blowing the shit out of each other. Then maybe that's not. Maybe there's like I feel like there's danger in that we should talk about.
I feel like the context is obviously needed as well, and the presenter, I think, of the piece which Sean had said, I had been asking him a question in the context of, dealing with issues in the GA between two jurisdictions. So the question had been set up for Sean to be talking about the UK and to be talking about the South as well. So context is definitely needed. And I mean, look, I live in a border area in Monaghan, 2 miles from Armagh. So I think even people here wouldn't take issue with what Sean said. I think it's understanding that, these things are said with context, and everyone knows Sean's views on the issue.
Are you sure there wasn't a rally with pitchforks? And are you sure there wasn't a rally with pitchforks and turf on fire out last night looking for Sean Cavanagh? Is that not really what the scene was like in the Monaghan Armagh border last night, Shane?
That's just a regular weekend thing that we go out searching for Sean Cavanagh since he pulled down Conor McManus in Croke Park and robbed us of an All-Ireland semi-final. So that happens every weekend. So there's nothing really new there. But yeah, I feel for Sean a bit in this one because look, he seems like a good guy, and that's quite tough for a Monaghan man to say about a Tyrone player. But he's been caught up in a storm that really, in all intents and purposes, should not be a storm. So it's a strange one.
Of course, you are the county that fell victim to the forget. You can forget about him as a man situation, actually. So if you talk about the beef is real, Shane Hannon versus Sean Cavanagh is perhaps actually the original beef here. I'm sure you were all on Joe Broddy's side at that moment. What have you got going on this morning, Shane?
Yeah, a few bits. We'll start with some soccer news for you this morning, lads. Premier League club captains, senior players and managers will be briefed on the medical aspects of Project Restart today. A number of players like Newcastle's on loan Danny Rose have voiced opposition to returning during a pandemic. It's believed the UK's Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Jonathan Van Tam, will be present on the video conference calls to allay fears about resuming. Meanwhile, police in England are softening their stance regarding the use of neutral venues. As many as a dozen Premier League sides are against the idea. Pat Nevin believes Premier League teams are letting themselves down with petty politicking over matches at neutral venues. The former Chelsea and Scotland man joined Off the Ball last night to discuss the Premier League resumption and was angry at the attitude of clubs behaving in a self-interested manner. You can read Pat's full thoughts at offtheball.com. Football league sides will meet today, meanwhile, to discuss whether to continue or end the current season. It's being widely reported teams in League 1 and League 2 will vote to cancel the campaign, with promotion and relegation being decided on a points per game ratio. I know that's something Miguel Delaney spoke about yesterday on OTB AM. The Portuguese top flight will resume on June 4th. It's been suspended since March because of the pandemic, and there are 10 rounds of games remaining there. Meanwhile, in the Bundesliga, of course, due to return, Emre Can and Belgian international Axel Witsel will miss Borussia Dortmund's derby with Schalke on Saturday as German football returns. Because Can and Witsel both need treatment for muscle strains, they have had to leave the team's quarantine bubble and therefore cannot play on Saturday regardless of their fitness. As the Bundesliga restarts, Dortmund are second in the table, 4 points off Bayern Munich. To Scotland, Rangers have failed in their attempts to force an independent investigation into the Scottish Professional Football League. The Ibrox club had joined with Hearts and Stranraer in calling for a general meeting after the lower league season was controversially ended last month. To matters rugby, World Rugby says there's been a positive response to their trials of new rules aimed at improving player welfare. Reducing the tackle height to waist level has been trialled in the French lower leagues. World Rugby says it's resulted in a threefold decrease in injuries and a 60% reduction in concussion. Meanwhile, tries scored at the base of the post will be outlawed when the sport resumes. The Guinness Pro 14 remain confident of completing a season suspended by COVID-19. The season has been on indefinite hold since March 19th. The finals in Cardiff, of course, cancelled. Glasgow head coach Dave Rennie has called for unbeaten Leinster to be crowned this season's champions. But Pro 14 commercial director Dermot Rigney says plans are afoot for the league to resume this side of 2021. To racing, Epsom Downs Racecourse has thanked the local conservators for allowing this year's Derby and Oaks to be staged behind closed doors. They hope to stage the classics in late July or indeed in August. A perimeter fence will be erected around the racecourse for a 24-hour period around race day. The chief executive of UK Athletics says that the governing body is absolutely not facing bankruptcy, despite taking a 7-figure hit by cancelling its flagship event. Joanna Coates admitted that pulling the plug on the anniversary games, scheduled for July 4th and 5th at the London Stadium, was a significant blow. She told the Times newspaper this morning that the governing body expected to lose more than £1 million from the cancellation and could not rule out redundancies. UK Athletics made losses of £825,000 in its most recent accounts and has already undergone 2 rounds of furloughing. And finally, lads, some Formula 1 news. Martin Brundle believes that there's a good chance that Sebastian Vettel might retire at the end of the current Formula 1 season. It follows Ferrari's announcement. The 4-time world champion will be leaving the team at the end of his contract. Ferrari seem to be focusing their future on their other driver, Charles Leclerc, who was signed to a new 5-year contract committing the team until 2024. Should mention in rally news as well, I have an interview done with Rosemary Smith, the Irish rally legend. That full interview has just gone live on offtheball.com. So plenty of interesting stories from her, reversing backwards over the Khyber Pass between Pakistan and Afghanistan, winning the Tulip Rally in the Netherlands in 1965, and indeed, lads, becoming the oldest person to drive a Formula 1 car in 2017 at the tender age of 79. So extraordinary stuff from Rosemary.
It's an amazing story. Can I just ask you, explain this Vettel beef? What's going on? And why does it matter?
It's an interesting one because Vettel last year was involved in a lot of accidents and incidents. He crashed into the back of Max Verstappen. He crashed into the back of Lando Norris and was involved in a lot of skirmishes. Now, look, these things happen in Formula 1. They're travelling at extortionate speeds, but Vettel was in his fair share of them. He seems quite frustrated at Ferrari. It seems to be an issue with personalities. I mean, he asked for more money, wanted to sign a new contract. His contract was up this year. They weren't going to give him more money. They were offering him a new contract, less money, and it seems they're putting this young guy, Charles Leclerc, as front and centre. Now, it seems a bit unfair in Vettel. He's a 4-time world champion, frustrated because, of course, Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton have a big stranglehold on Formula 1 at the moment, but it's an interesting one. It's hard to see Vettel going anywhere else at the moment, given the wages he looks for, but it would be a sad way for him to go out of Formula 1 because he's an extraordinary driver, 4-time world champion, as I said. And it'll be interesting to see who takes his place. I mean, Carlos Sainz from McLaren and Daniel Ricciardo from Renault have been the 2 names mooted. So who knows? But the merry-go-rounds among drivers are no stranger to Formula 1. But sad way for Vettel to leave Ferrari for sure.
Absolutely. Shane Hannon, thanks a million for joining us this morning.
Cheers, lads.
Breaking news. We've got a statement in from one of the parties in this morning's Beef is Real. Kieran Cunningham. 2-word statement, Michael Jordan-esque 2-word statement. Go away, he says on Twitter. No word from Team Boohig just yet, but our people are in touch with his people, and we might have something to bring you on that before 10 o'clock. So a short, snappy statement from Kieran Cunningham. Not the end, I dare say. Not the last we'll hear from either of these parties. Coming up this morning, between now and 10 o'clock, we've got the sports pages coming in just a second. The best ever Manchester United Premier League 11 with Colm Boohig and Daniel Harris. How's the head with Tipperary's Ashley McCarthy before Columbo Culture Hall of Fame with Now TV. Paul Howard is going to be inducting Columbo after 9 o'clock this morning. And then we'll be chatting as well about the UFC's return. Chuck Mindenhall of The Athletic will be joining myself and Joe a little bit later on to chat through what happened in Jacksonville at the weekend and what the plans are for Dana White, for the UFC and for the sport as a whole over the next couple of weeks and months. Before all that, it is time for the sports pages.
OTB AM.
We'll start with offtheball.com. Pat Nevin there leading the way. I am angry about it is the headline. Nevin on Premier League and neutral venues, voicing the concern that Premier League clubs really should be taking the opportunity to go back and actually play games, whether it is behind neutral venues or not, and the idea that certain clubs are forcing the issue of either playing home and away or nothing at all doesn't reflect well. Meanwhile, Celtic welcome rejection of investigation into SPFL vote to end season. Shane has already mentioned that story there about World Rugby outlawing tries from balls grounded against post protector. It's an effing joke. Danny Rose hits out at plans to restart Premier League, and David Ginola says he nearly retired after USA 94 heartbreak.
First up for me is the Irish Independent this morning. And the Irish Independent have a couple of big stories in their back there. Why a rights issue is stopping RTE from showing old GA classic games. The rights issue is fairly simple. Air Sports have the rights. RTE don't have the rights. And, if you're going to show games you don't have the rights for, that kind of is a breach of contract. So this is obviously a little bit of negotiation that RTE are trying to do through the media to put pressure on Air or the GA to release games. That seems to me to be what's going on here. Because I can't imagine RTE would be very happy if Virgin Media rocked up to a GA match that they didn't have rights for and started showing them. This is essentially exactly the same thing. It's just that that's what RTE are looking for. And maybe they don't want to pay whatever the price that Air Sports are looking for at this time, given that there's nothing else happening. And they're not going to have to pay a rights fee this year to the GA, or at least the same rights fee to the GA that they would have had to pay for all the games they were showing. There was another story there, I don't know if it was Dan McDonald's story at the back of the Indo there about the League of Ireland's underlying conditions and why that makes it so vulnerable. That's one of the other stories that they're covering there. And the GA looking for further state aid as the 50 million loss looms large.
The Irish Times this morning leads with that story of the rule change in rugby. World Rugby outlaws tries against the post, writes John O'Sullivan. New law will come into effect immediately. There will be games, but not with fans, says Owens. This is Gary Owens of the FAI talking about what's going to happen over the next couple of months, really kind of speculating about what's going to happen over the next couple of months, as we all are really. You kind of mentioned the League of Ireland elements there already, Ger. And as we've already alluded to this morning, the Bundesliga story, cardboard fans piped applause, stadiums in the COVID age. Borussia Mönchengladbach have sold 12,000 cardboard cutouts of fans so far, 19 quid to put a cardboard ear in the stands, and visiting fans can book cutouts for the away end as well. And Sean Moran writing about the reaction to Cavanagh and how the reaction to that interview has just been nothing short of bizarre. He says he goes back to lines in Sean Cavanagh's book, the piece by Declan Bogue last year, I think, wasn't it, when the Come Out You Black and Tans video emerged of the Tyrone team, to kind of show the fairly conscientious mindset that Sean Cavanagh has and how that's been put out there in the past. And I guess the reaction has been sort of strange. Like, it's, Ger, I'm not sure about you, like maybe I just kind of wasn't really looking through Twitter that much on Sunday night, but I didn't really see too many people on my feed at least actually bashing Cavanagh for this, because that kind of would have been a strange thing to do, I would have thought.
Yeah, and look, I don't want to in any way represent them or put forward their side of the argument, but like, it's fairly straightforward. People talking in a certain way about something that a cohort of people disagree with, and then cancel culture kicks in, and all of a sudden Sean Cavanagh is essentially the new Maggie Thatcher, and there's no real room for nuance. I did see some people who were quite nuanced saying, Irish nationalists don't feel like you should really refer to this territory as the UK. Where they're striving for United Ireland, and anything that in any way diminishes that outcome in the short term is therefore a wrong use of language, and that needs to be discussed. I saw some people putting forward that viewpoint without the ad hominem attacks that essentially kicked off this the beef is real joke that we've been talking about this morning. Because so many people completely overreacted, as opposed to saying, well, look, it is actually time that we do have a conversation around the language. Like, do we in the 26 counties really actually want a united Ireland? And if we do, then you're going to have to get used to the fact that it won't look like 26 counties annexing the 6 counties and everything is then suddenly green, white and orange and everybody has to shut the F up, or because that's not how that's going to work. You won't ever get anywhere if you're going to inflict the way that situation was inflicted 100 years ago, led to violence. If you inflict again, you're going to repeat the mistakes just on the other side. For sure. Like, it's we should definitely just kind of hammer at home that obviously the Buff Egan thing we were chatting about at the start is obviously a joke. Like that's even kind of the nature of how that's kind of turned into a completely unconnected beef over the course of the last 12 to 18 hours is just kind of hilarious in itself. I personally just can't see how
you're listening to that and you can completely hammer Sean Cavanagh for that or get completely carried away with what he says. Like Sean Moran's headline really is something I would totally agree with. The reaction has been nothing short of bizarre, really, that there is a certain potentially insecurity as well to people hearing Sean Cavanagh and reacting like that. Literally 2 words. Believe me, you can misspeak around these sorts of things fairly easily. It doesn't represent your entire political worldview.
No, and it's actually, but sometimes it is worth having these conversations and taking these opportunities to go, okay, there's clearly a cohort of people out there who agree with calling Sean Cavanagh names because that's how he spoke or that's how he thinks. Like, let's just for a second, consider the possibility that there are people who are from a traditionally nationalist community in the north who kind of feel like, well, we exist in a real world here. We live in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is currently governed by the Assembly, but it is still part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That's how it has been codified. And if there is a desire for people on this side of the border to change that, then we have to recognise that those people need to be brought with you as opposed to bullied and shouted down and called names, because that hasn't really worked the other way around, has it?
Mm. Yeah, I should actually say that. I kind of suggested there that Sean Cavanagh misspoke. If he didn't, and he said, us up here in the UK, like as you just said there, that's fine too. And the idea that you're banging down the door and saying this kind of shows that you hate the idea of Ireland is obviously lunacy. But if the case was the actual view is up here in the UK and that was his real view, like obviously that's totally fine as well. But I think as Sean Moran goes to point out here, that is not the view. And I think most people who have read Sean Cavanagh's book or have heard him speak before realise that that's not the view either.
The next one for me is the Examiner this morning. So their front page is Irish Rugby's roadmap to return is taking shape. This is Donald Lenihan's piece, and just kind of teasing out some of the details of what might come next and how it might look in terms of at least rugby being played between the provinces, matches against each other. Pro 14 chiefs consider bio bubbles in effort to restart the game. I hadn't seen that story before. That's from Brendan O'Brien there, saying that the organisers are considering the operation of the bio bubbles. We're working on clean venues, and testing is obviously the key point here, and how quickly you can get results back. The modelling that the tournament team here has worked on is bio bubble scenario where there's an absolutely clean venue or campus when no one leaves or comes in after a while. So that's that part of the story. Tipperary Hurling senior manager Liam Sheedy is convinced an intercounty championship behind closed doors, along with stringent safety measures, would lift the nation. And so he's saying a championship behind closed doors would lift the nation, but also it's better than nothing. And I think, John Horan was very clear that behind closed doors isn't on the agenda at the moment, but it's worth having those conversations. It's worth, what would that look like? Why would we be doing that? When could we possibly do that? You're seeing some of the science. Again, I'm always loath to accept at face value the science is coming out saying, our sport is going to be able to go ahead because apparently in football you're only like 90 seconds in close contact with somebody over the course of 90 minutes of a match. That sounds, it's interesting that that figure has emerged and it looks so positive, just as we're trying to convince the world that football coming back is the right thing to do. But again, that's the figures that they're putting out there. And then Kieran Kingston has been talking about digital platforms being a way of the future for county teams. So I think the whole world is looking at new ways of working and whether or not we're going to have an office-based culture the way we have traditionally had, and whether or not we're going to have meeting-based cultures the way we've traditionally had in all aspects of our life. So production meetings for this show might not always happen in person the way that they would have happened traditionally 6 months ago, 3 months ago. In GAA, do you need all of your support team traveling to every training session? And there's definitely a case to be made that you could do your strength and conditioning from home, as opposed to, especially if your commute is 2.5, 3 hours. Is there a way of making sure that your team is bonded in the same manner if you're the Mayo football team and everybody's in their apartment in Dublin or is in a gym in Dublin separately, versus getting them all to come over 3 nights a week to training? I don't know. Kieran Kingston is not sure, and I haven't delved into exactly the pros and cons of what he's talking about, but you can see if you're particularly at the stage that he's at now with his second stint, you'd want to get everybody together and you'd want to gel them. You'd want to see them all exactly how stressed they were getting and how shared their experience was.
It's remarkable actually how quickly the sports organisations and sports teams have actually just pivoted towards this already, and I think it's probably just been conditioned this way for a while. I think even county teams that would have been located in two separate parts of the country, for example, have probably already been set up to realise that there will be parts of the week where you are separate. And like I guess there is a good history of inter-county managers, if we stick with GAA for a moment, picking up the phone to players and having the chats with them, and I don't know whether it's either persuading them to come back or seeing how they're fixed. There actually has been a bit of a check-in culture when it comes to managers and their players in the past. So it seems to me, on the outside looking in and listening to people like Kingston, listening to people like Mike Work the other night, the transition towards this new normal has been fairly seamless for them, and it's probably something that's going to stick for a good while after this all ends. The London Times back page, clubs to win ground battle is the main story here. Government backs down over neutral venues. Now worried players must be convinced to play. So they've won this battle really, that Premier League clubs will be able to use their own grounds to complete the season after positive talks between senior football figures, government officials and the police. So the concern was obviously that fans may actually gather around stadiums and show up to the games even though they're not allowed into the stadiums, and obviously that would be very unsafe indeed. But the police have given the assurances that actually that's going to be fine. So the next step now, as the headline alludes to there, is just to persuade the players that everything's going to be fine on the pitch. The other couple of stories then from the London Times this morning: UK Athletics £1 million cash blow, but the chief executive says the organisation is absolutely not facing bankruptcy. Royal Ascot on track for June then. It looks set to go ahead in its scheduled slot next month as preparations for the resumption of horse racing on June 1st take shape.
The Mirror is next. The Mirror this morning is Barca come home Pep, and this is Manchester City. Confident Pep Guardiola will see out his deal despite former Barcelona chief Joan Laporta revealing he wants him back at the Camp Nou. So that would be definitely an interesting outcome if at the end of all this, Pep decides, right, I'm going home, I've had enough. I want to go back and finish the job that I started, particularly because there's only a year or two left of Leo Messi. And that story there, I don't know if you can make it out. Jens, you're fit. COVID is no big deal. So Jens Lehmann telling it like it is. Jens Lehmann says players have to cope with the coronavirus and insists it's not a big concern for fit young athletes. The Arsenal Invincible, interesting choice of, interesting moment to drop the word invincible. But yeah, the Arsenal Invincible suffered from COVID-19 in March and said, I found it less bad than when I have had the flu. So there you go. He's on the board of Hertha Berlin. Jens Lehmann, I'm hard, basically. Come and have me, COVID. Oh, look, you tried. You failed. Come and have me.
Maybe that Arsenal team were actually informed after they got their Premier League winners' medals, you're actually invincible. Like, no matter what happens, no matter what pandemic comes, you are literally invincible. And they were like, all right, that's fantastic. And actually, we're hearing Jens Lehmann talking about his own invincibility today. So good on Jens Lehmann for not getting even the flu, it seems. The back page of the Irish Daily Mail for me is baptism of fire. 8 successive games for Kenny in FIFA proposal. So Stephen Kenny could have a bit of a baptism of fire to start off his Republic of Ireland management career with the senior team. It could involve 8 games crammed into a single international spot spanning November and December, and the congested fixture list would embrace 6 Nations League games and the Euro 2020 playoff semi-final against Slovakia.
That sounds brilliant, doesn't it?
A nice festival of football, of international football.
Like if you're trying to get the team together and you're trying to instill a way of playing for the next couple of seasons and you're trying to lay down exactly what it is you want your team to do, all of a sudden you've got this weird hothouse to be able to do it over a short period of time.
If you're getting a new manager bounce, then certainly it's going to be for a more sustained period and it's going to be more effective. Like I've always said that as long as the Slovakia game isn't the first game up, this is an ideal situation for Stephen Kenny. It's the perfect time to be a new manager because any sort of cohesion, if there's any time the cohesion is going to go out the door with previous managers that have been there for a long time, now is the time where that's going to happen.
That's a good point. Next with us is the Star, and there's a couple of things here. Home and away is the back page headline. Clubs poised to win battle and ditch neutral ground. That's the story we've already talked about. And away, Stars threatened to boycott the return. Raheem Sterling is concerned about returning to training. Dean Smith of Aston Villa said two of his players have asthma and may not play, while a Brighton first-team squad member has a partner with a serious underlying condition. Rangers have been urged to end the war in Scotland, and Liam Sheedy is calling for extra funding to play a role in funding behind closed doors GA Championship in a bid to lift the nation's spirits. He says that seeing some action would trump everything in terms of the overall well-being of the country, assuming it's safe to do so. I think there's probably going to be a case that in 5 months' time, we'll know a good bit more about this, and that there probably will be an opportunity for us to play some games. And then there's a great picture there of when Irish footballers ruled Europe, and that is Sporting Gijón, Kevin Moran, and Gary Lineker, who told a great story about playing golf with Michael Jordan on Twitter last night. I don't know if you saw that, Owen.
No, I didn't. What did he say?
He said that he got a phone call from somebody at Sunningdale saying Michael Jordan wants to come and play golf with a couple of his basketball buddies on Sunday. And Lineker's like, Sunday, okay, he needs a member. And they're like, yeah, that's why we're ringing you. And he was like, when they asked if I was available, I said, yeah, absolutely. And so the phone arrives. The phone rings the next day, and it's like, oh, listen, he wants to bring some more of his buddies. There's going to be 6 of them, so you need to get another member. So he rang another member, I think an ex-pro who was also a friend of his, who he played with, and it turns out Samuel L. Jackson was now going to be there. So Samuel L. Jackson, Michael Jordan, and 2 other current NBA players and 2 other people show up. They're there early, and Lineker says his buddy was a bit of a gambler, so they're on the first, and he looks over at Jordan and he goes, would you like to wager? Do you fancy a little side bet on? Probably didn't know exactly the stuff that we know now about Michael Jordan. And Jordan kind of takes a cigar out and looks at him and goes, yeah, absolutely. Eyes lighting up. And your man goes, how much do you want to bet? And Jordan looks at him and goes, however much is going to make you uncomfortable.
And his home got repossessed shortly thereafter.
That bit wasn't said.
The back page of the Irish Sun is Fear We Go, Prem Crunch Talks with Scared Stars. So another series of Crunch Talks today. Today it is with Premier League players. You can see a coach at Levante there disinfecting the ball at one of their La Liga and one of their La Liga stars, I should say, during training. So they're actually spraying the player and spraying the football. And those Liam Sheedy comments as well, like fairly interesting actually. Like I know we've mentioned him a couple of times, but it's big that he's saying that he'd love to see the ban lifted on GAA grounds, saying I know that there is going to be a lifting in some places where people can go and venture for May 18th. If it can't be policed or supported, you lock the gates. But I do think we could trust the clubs and members to respect the rules and just having these pitches available.
Yeah, it's the first person to break ranks on that. Because I think certainly the hierarchy have said that they don't really want that to happen. I do think that there's a bit too much fear about the picture of the COVIDiots. So yeah, it'll be a picture for 24 hours. There'll be a backlash against the backlash, and we'll all move on pretty quickly. The Guardian is next. The Guardian. Club set for green light to finish season in their own stadiums. That's the story that we've been talking about. The UK Athletics story is the 2 million body blow UK Athletics can't cost his anniversary games called off. And they also have a picture of Sebastian Vettel saying his shock Ferrari exit shakes up the Formula One drivers market. As Shane pointed out, he's a 4-time world champion, but he was world champion when he was with Red Bull. He hasn't been a world champion since he's been at Ferrari. I haven't watched enough Formula One, but I was under the impression that the Ferrari car had been nowhere near good enough to be competitive with Lewis Hamilton over the last while. So is this still like everybody wants to drive for Ferrari because you get to wear the red and they pay you loads of money?
I think it was mentioned in relation to Lewis Hamilton recently that how cool would it be to see him win in a Ferrari? Like it's definitely doesn't have the same appeal, him doing it in a Mercedes, but I'm not sure does that necessarily transfer to the idea that he would have as good a chance in a Ferrari. I think that's not the case whatsoever.
Yeah, it would be great to see him win, but he's not going to win. Is that not the problem? They're no good.
That's certainly, again, haven't watched enough of it to actually say for sure, but certainly Mercedes seem to have had the technological advantage over the last few seasons anyway. The Daily Telegraph, second last one for me, risk or restart. Players to be told Premier League to outline new normal at meeting. As mentioned, that meeting's taking place today. And Fowler voices his COVID-19 fears over Townsend. So this is Andros Townsend's dad, who's been out saying that he can't enjoy football restart and that captains to seek promises over BAME players' safety. England bowlers to be first to return to nets on Monday is the latest on the cricket, and roadmap to signal way for competitive sport as well. That's the latest from the UK.
The Irish News is next. I actually can't read that on. Sorry.
The Irish News this morning, Turbot saying missing promotion will only act as a spur for Armagh, and Celtic welcome defeated resolution, but Rangers vow to fight on. That's the latest there from the Irish News. And then the last paper this morning for me is the Herald. No fans for Irish games. Closed doors matches for 2020 dampener for Kenny. Golf getting back to normal. Meanwhile, this is the golf course superintendent of Hoth Golf Club, Ger Morgan, works in the 9th green at Hoth there. You can probably make that out. His golf clubs get ready to reopen. And nostalgia isn't what it used to be for RTE is the headline in the Herald with regards to the rights of the old games that RTE are looking to broadcast. Right, it is 20 to 9 this morning. We're back discussing the greatest ever Manchester United Premier League 11 with Colm Boohig and Daniel Harris in just a moment. But first, Shane Hannon spoke to the legendary rally driver Rosemary Smith over the weekend. It's an hour-long interview and well worth checking out. You can read the main lines from it on offtheball.com. You can listen back in the OTB podcast network or watch it on our YouTube channel. Here's a bit of that.
Again, just when I was going out, one of the mechanics, he said to me, and I had one of these neck braces on, which is very difficult to wear. How the boys wear them. God, I have the greatest admiration for the drivers today. But anyway, they had this on me. And just when I was going out, this mechanic, and he said, you see the red button down there? And I said, and, I couldn't see anything because I couldn't bend my head. And I put my hand out. He said, don't touch it. He said, just if you crash and burst into flames, just pull the button. That was very, very encouraging, just as they were pushing me out of the pit.
All right, Colm Boohig, a very good morning to you.
Owen, how are you?
Very well. Daniel Harris, you're with us as well. What's the crack?
Hi, all right.
Colm, we'll put you in the firing line first of all. You've done this to yourself again, where you've decided to pick a team from recent memory. Today you're going for Manchester United's best ever 11 of the Premier League era. Walk us through it. What have you gone for here?
That's right. I've gone for an expansive 4-4-2 formation, which could be a hybrid of 4-3-3 if circumstances dictate. So I'll go through it here. In goal, Peter Schmeichel. Left back, Dennis Irwin. Centre backs are Rio Ferdinand and Jaap Stam. Right back is Gary Neville. Left wing is Cristiano Ronaldo. Central midfield is Paul Scholes and Captain Roy Keane. The right side of midfield is David Beckham. And up front is Eric Cantona and Ruud van Nistelrooy. So to say that I was ambivalent about leaving certain people out here is an understatement. Such are the riches on offer. That's my team.
What was the toughest call?
Oh, undoubtedly Wayne Rooney and Ryan Giggs. I mean, with one you're talking about United's greatest ever goal scorer, with one you're talking about the greatest ever appearance maker, and obviously they're both fantastic players. So those two were very difficult to leave out. But if you read my article on offtheball.com about this team, at the end I do have an alternative formation of a 4-2-3-1, which allows Giggs and Rooney into it and Beckham and Van Nistelrooy out of it. But the team that I've named out, this 4-4-2, is what I think is the strongest Manchester United 11 in the Premier League era. And I think this 11 would take on any other Premier League 11 era and beat them.
Can I ask what are the criteria? Like, is it the players' impact on the club? Is it his best ever performance? Is it the whole season? Like, what? So how do you decide over one over the other? Because Ryan Giggs' greatest ever performance as an individual, his best ever season as an individual, or is it him as a centre midfielder? What are your criteria?
I'm glad you asked her. I do have criteria again, very similar to the Irish Premier League 11 that I named. So every player has to play in their natural position. And the biggest thing for me is the Premier League contribution that each player made to the Manchester United cause. So it's not necessarily their longevity that gets them in. It's what they did with the time that they had. And that's why these 11 are in. So it's a team as well. It's not just 11 individuals. So this is a team that can beat any other team. Hence the right-hand side with Gary Neville and David Beckham and their fantastic partnership. So it's unfortunate. I do have to leave out huge names. The Manny Vidic is another name I have to leave out very reluctantly. But this is what I think is the best team and all the players playing in their most natural position who have been successful at Man United. And this is what I ended up with.
Daniel Harris, what was your initial reaction when you saw that team?
Yeah, it's pretty good. I would say I think you might have failed your own criteria though, because if you're going for natural position, you've got to have Dennis Irwin at right back, as I have. Not for that reason.
I think he played more left back, didn't he? United.
He did, but not. But he started at right back. He moved to left back because he could, rather than because that was his natural position. But yeah, I mean, that was a good team. I picked my team on slightly different criteria. I guess what I'm looking for when I picked it is I'm partly looking for every player's highest level. If every player plays to their height, to their top level, who am I going to pick? And I also, I guess, was picking the team thinking if United were playing the best teams that I've ever seen, what do I think United would have to do to be able to beat anyone? And that was what I was motivated for when I picked my team. So I also left out some players that I would not ordinarily leave out of this kind of thing.
So run us through it, Daniel.
Okay, so my team was Schmeichel in goal, best to ever do it. Nothing else to say, really. Then Owen at right back, Stam Ferdinand in the middle, and Patrice Evra on the left. Then I went for a midfield three of Ince, Keane and Scholes. And then up front, I went for Ronaldo on the right, Van Nistelrooy in the middle, and Giggs on the left.
No Rooney.
No, I mean, the one that was the hardest to leave out was Eric Cantona, because, I mean, I grew up watching Eric Cantona. I was at Selhurst Park when he booted Matthew Simmons. Eric Cantona is everything I think a footballer and a human being should be. However, I guess what I'm thinking is if United were playing the best team that I ever saw, which was Barcelona, I basically thought, well, if you get a chance, you need to score, and the person most likely to do that is Ruud van Nistelrooy, and you can't afford to play two strikers against Barcelona or against the majority of the best teams that you might play. So I went for Paul Ince, who, because he went to Liverpool and because of the way he celebrated scoring for Liverpool, and then because of all the gobshiting subsequently, is someone who I think that people forget how good he was. But between about 1991 and 1995, Paul Ince was the best midfielder in the Premier League. And so I felt that if you had a midfield three of him, Roy Keane and Paul Scholes, it would be extremely difficult for any team to beat you. If I was picking a team just to play in a bog-standard Premier League game, then I could very easily play David Beckham on the right, as you did, and then play Ronaldo on the left. But my favourite Ronaldo was 2006-07 Ronaldo, when he was still playing on the right, before he sort of turned into a relentless, remorseless accumulator. When he was playing on the right, he was still a lot of fun. He was still playing partly to win at football, and partly to take the piss. So I put Ronaldo on the right for that reason. And I would say the other change I think we had was I had Evra in my team and you didn't. As far as I can see, Evra is the best fullback I've seen at United, and it's not close. Irwin was excellent, and it's a difficult decision between him and Gary Neville. But the thing about Irwin that always sticks in my mind, and I know that in a long career it shouldn't, is when he got burned up by Stoichkov when United got thrashed by Barcelona, and Stoichkov just stepped on the gas and Irwin couldn't go with him. And that is not something you would ever say about Patrice Evra of anyone. He was fast, he was strong, and actually he also got you goals. Once Rio Ferdinand stopped going forward for set pieces, and Evra started going in front of him, started scoring goals as well. And I would say that him and Ashley Cole were by far the two best fullbacks in the world for probably a three-year period. And I'm not sure you could say that about Neville or Evra. About Neville or Irwin. So yeah, Evra is by far the best fullback I've seen at United, so that's why I picked him.
Colm, was there any consideration to shoehorn Paul Ince ahead of Paul Scholes in your team?
Well, I was asked last night by a friend of mine, what would be your backup 11? And Ince was straight in there. Ince was fantastic. Daniel's completely right. And I guess it's the way he left the club and the fact that he played for Liverpool, that Manchester United fans might have a different opinion of Ince. But if you judge him as a player, he's fantastic. I mean, when Roy Keane did that Best of Enemies documentary with Patrick Vieira a few years ago, he put Ince in the team ahead of Scholes, Keane, in his United team. So he's obviously highly rated by the players that played with him. And he was fantastic. You just have to look back at clips. But no, I mean, I had to go with my midfield too. Actually, my midfield too was probably the most straightforward selection that I had, which for me was Keane and Scholes immediately. There was no problems there.
Can we talk a little bit about Scholes? Because our classic game club this week is the Juventus Manchester United second leg Champions League semi-final from 98-99, and obviously everybody famously knows that Scholes and Keane both pick up bookings and miss the final. But maybe what everybody doesn't pay attention to too much is the fact that Scholes wasn't first choice that night for the away game. Daniel, it seems there was a long period of time where Alex Ferguson felt like Nicky Butt and Paul Scholes were interchangeable in some respects, particularly in a big away match where you would expect that Man United need to get on the ball a bit. He went for Nicky Butt against Deschamps and Zidane and Edgar Davids. Why was it such a close run thing in Alex Ferguson's head for such a long period of time that these two players were fairly close to each other in standard?
I don't think it's so much that they were fairly close to each other in standard. I think it's that you're looking for a different thing from them. And it's also notable in the treble season that Scholes also didn't start the games against Arsenal. But Fergie always started because I think he felt that he needed some extra ballast in midfield to enable him to play two strikers and to play Beckham and Giggs, who are basically mainly on the touchline. So I think it was not a question of quality, but a question of balance. And Scholes hadn't quite established himself as someone you would always pick. Later era Scholes became that because when he moved back, he started controlling the game. So at that point, Scholes was an essential. But when the early days of Scholes, he was mainly about scoring. He actually talked about this himself quite recently, that he felt that his job was to score goals. And if you're playing with two strikers and two wingers, then when you're playing the better teams, if you've got a midfield player who's mainly trying to score goals, that's a problem. I mean, we saw it with Chelsea, we saw it with Liverpool, in that Lampard always played on the left of a three, and that was essential because it meant that he could, having three there, because it meant that he could concentrate on scoring, and he didn't do that much else. And similarly with Gerrard, managers throughout his career struggled with knowing where to put him. And he had his best season when Benitez played him behind Torres, because then he didn't have to do anything else. So I think that's why Scholes was left out. It wasn't an issue of him not being a better player than Butt. It was just sometimes a different option was necessary.
Could he not have done what Nicky Butt did, though? And also, I guess maybe this is a conversation about Ferguson as a tactician. It's almost like you couldn't fit Gerrard and Lampard in the same team. It's like you couldn't fit Keane and Scholes in the same team on the biggest of the big games, when actually you could. They could both have played quite deep, and it would have been a different type of a more tiki-taka style team, I suspect. But why did that not work out for them?
I guess it did work in that he played Scholes in most of the big European home games, and had Scholes not been suspended for the final, I'm absolutely certain he would have played Scholes, not Butt. But I guess with football, you add something in one place, you got to take it away in another. That's like the game is perfectly balanced, and sometimes different players. If you look at the two finals that Fergie won, the two European finals that Fergie won, I'm pretty sure that the starting 11s in both those games didn't start any other game together. And if you look at what's considered to be the classic United 11 from the treble season, the one that everyone would name that has Scholes in it, I think that team only started one game together. So football, it's not science, and it doesn't always work in the way that you expect it to work. And sometimes you have to take note of the fact that your opposition are good. And if you want to play two strikers, then you can't have a midfield player, and you can't leave the entirety of the midfield running to Roy Keane, is I guess what I'm saying, although he did do a pretty good job of doing that, and also did a pretty good job of that for Ireland as well.
If you talk about the treble-winning team and you talk about two strikers, I'm not sure, did either of you guys get tempted by York and Cole at all? Especially Colm, I think you were making the point about having a bit of chemistry in your team and players that know each other and that can clearly, not just putting names together out of a hat and putting your 11 best players on the pitch, an actual team in these fantasy stakes we've got this morning. Like, why not Cole and York? Did they come into your consideration at all?
They did. You could pick the front six from the treble-winning season and just leave it at that and walk away. I mean, Daniel has got more ambitious than me because he's trying to take on Europe with his team. But mine is just a bog-standard Premier League team that would beat all other Premier League sides in history. And if you wanted to, you could definitely put Cole and York up there. But no, I had to look at the overall picture of the 28 years of the Premier League, and I was thinking it's Cantona and Van Nistelrooy for me. Obviously, Rooney was very close into it, but like Ferguson brought some fantastic strikers to the club. I mean, for a manager who was seen to have a weak spot in goal as a goalkeeper, Bayer, and to recruit central midfield after Roy Keane left. I mean, the list of strikers that he brought in, Alex Ferguson, to the club, like Brian McClare, Bring back Mark Hughes, Colin York, as you say, Solskjaer, Sheringham, Tevez, Berbatov, Van Persie, and Rooney. But I had to go with a guy in Cantona who, when he joined Man United in November 1992, United were 10th after 15 games. They were going nowhere. They hadn't won the league since 1967. And at the end of that season, they win the league for the first time since then. And the following year, they win the double, and Cantona gets PFA Player of the Year. Then, of course, he gets suspended after the Kung Fu kick. United lose the league by a goal to Blackburn, lose the FA Cup final to Everton, and then Cantona returns, and we know what happens there with the double. So what Cantona did in his time at United puts him into the team straight away, ahead of Colin York, who had an absolutely wonderful partnership, brilliant, and are obviously essential to what happened in the treble. But they don't touch Cantona or Van Nistelrooy in terms of talent and ability. And for Van Nistelrooy, again, another player who fell out with Ferguson spectacularly. The League Cup final in 2006 against Wigan, threw a huge strap after not being brought on at all from the bench. And it was inevitable that he was going to leave that summer. But you forget about Van Nistelrooy. His first 3 years at the club, he was sensational. And he was at a club at a transitional period, like the 5 years between 2001 2006. United only won the league once. So Van Nistelrooy was playing with often in a very mediocre side around players who either developing or frankly inadequate. And he was scoring 20 plus goals in every season, I think, except 04-05 when he was injured a lot. So I can't move those people out. I can't take Cantona and Van Nistelrooy for anybody else for those reasons alone. But Colin York, yeah, absolutely. They could be in another different sort of United 11, but not this one.
Van Nistelrooy, I would say, is his form in the second half of 02-03 is probably the best I've ever seen from a United player. And in Champions League, he got, even though he never played in a team that was good enough to get to a final, he got 38 goals in 47 games. And he also did it in Europe for PSV and for Madrid. And I think that of all the great players that we've seen in the Premier League era, he is one of the ones who people know was great, but history has not judged him to be as great as he was because he was playing with players like Cleberson and Djemba Djemba. He basically turned up during Fergie's sabbatical, should we call it? Not even sabbatical, testimonial. It's probably a better way. Looking at some of the players that arrived at that point and wondering quite why that might have been. Forlan, Bellion also. I mean, obviously Forlan was better than Bellion and Djemba Djemba, but still, there was some things that went on with the transfer that suggested that perhaps, Michael Crick's documentary, The Boss, on this topic is excellent. But the thing about Van Nistelrooy was that he was not a guarantee of a goal, but at his best, he was almost a guarantee of a goal. In the 02-03 run-in, he scored 15 goals in the last 10 games and won at least once in every game. But I've never seen anything quite like that, where you were absolutely certain that someone was going to score. I think that I did think about up front just going for Rooney, Ronaldo, Tevez, because the way the partnership worked was so good. But I couldn't leave Van Nistelrooy out because he was one of the. He wasn't as good as Henry, and the comparison was always between the two of them. But he was the next best in the world at the time. And I'm not quite sure you could ever have said that about Dwight York, although it is tempting because I think he got 26 goals and 24 assists in 98-99. And to contribute that to the greatest season in English football history is no small matter. 24 assists is the same as what David Beckham got in that season, which was the best season he ever had. And to manage that along with the goals is it's astonishing, really. But
I think you're right about that. I think certainly that's where the argument comes in. So Van Nistelrooy has this amazing period where he is the focal point of the entire team. And I understand that, we're nitpicking here, levels of greatness. But again, it's complete recency bias because we've just rewatched that Juve Manchester United game. And what York and Cole do as a partnership in that game is mesmeric, particularly in the first half when the team is 2-0 down. It's their interaction. It's their ability to find each other when they're running opposite directions, when one has their back to the other, that actually gets them back into the game. And in retrospect, I'm really thrilled that Andy Cole gets the winner at the very end obviously it's not the winner, but it's the winner on the night, because his performance deserved it, and he'd been so close to scoring in it. But like Cole that night was muscular. His first touch was good. His heading ability was good. He was abrasive. He was everything that you wanted him to be, while he was still in the shadow of Eric Cantona. You felt like he wasn't going to fulfill that. And York's ability to unlock that, I think, makes him one of the great teammates. And if you're talking about, we're taking players at the high heights and how good they were, I would argue that those two that night were unplayable. And over the course of that season, they both hit their career marks. Like, there's an argument for them to be in this team on the basis of that season alone.
Yeah, I think that's fair. If you're playing 4-4-2, then you could definitely put them in. Cole in particular was astonishingly good that night. And he's another player who I think that people who didn't watch him every week don't realise what he was, because when he turned up at United, he was basically just a finisher. And usually when a club signs strikers like that, if they either hit it off straight away or they don't work. There are very few strikers I've seen turn up at United, not be good at the beginning and eventually become really good. But with Cole, that wasn't the case. And he, over the course of his first 2 or 3 seasons, he transitioned from a kind of a one-touch finisher, like played through by Beardsley or a low cross, to an all-round brilliant centre forward who could do a little bit of everything. And that was why him and York worked. They could both come short. They both had a great first touch. They could both head. They could both volley. They could both finish. And it didn't matter who went where, because each could do the other one's job. And that was why I think that worked really well. But Van Nistelrooy was a level above both of them, I would say, at his best. Like, able to take the ball away from goal and run past 2 or 3 defenders and score. And he would create his own goals also, whereas I would say the other two were quite dependent on service, whereas Van Nistelrooy, for some time, who's at United, got so little service, but still managed to find goals.
All right, Colm, Daniel, thanks a million for joining us this morning.
Cheers, see you again.
Cheers, Daniel. Who's got the better team there, Ger?
I think Everett has to be in that team. So I just leaning a little bit towards Daniel. But look, they're both pretty good teams. Wayne Rooney not making the Man United team of the Premier League, I think, is going to incite some comment from Manchester United fans.
Well, John Giles didn't pick him in his best ever Manchester United 11 a couple of weeks ago. I will say it was best ever. The Premier League players that made Giles' 11 were Schmeichel, Irwin, Stam, Vidic, Scholes, Keane and Ronaldo. No ever there either.
We didn't talk about Stam. Stam was sensational. I can't believe Alex Ferguson burned him out of the club. For what? For I don't know. What the hell was he thinking? It was insane.
Absolutely, it was. There's more on that coming this week in our Classic Game Club 99, the second leg, Juventus against United in Turin, that famous night. Right, it is 9:02 on this Wednesday morning. We've got plenty coming up for you over the next hour. A little later, we're going to be checking in with Chuck Mindenhall of The Athletic about the return of the UFC last weekend. But up next, it's Paul Howard on our latest episode of the OTB Culture Hall of Fame. And right before that, we're going to hear from Tipperary star Aisling McCarthy. She joined Will O'Callaghan for the latest Has the Head, and we're checking in with athletes across the country, I should say, to hear how they're getting on.
Yeah, obviously, it's a really uncertain time for everyone, and it can be tough at times, even just to keep busy and things like that. You'd be getting a little bit bored, but it has to be done. And I guess once you kind of get into a bit of a routine and used to it, it's not too bad. And I suppose from my point of view, I'm coming back from Australia, so it was kind of a breath of fresh air nearly to get that little break and transition into life back at home again. I suppose last year when I came back, I kind of got hurried straight back into Gaelic and working and everything, so it's kind of nice to have that little bit of a break at the moment, and I'm just kind of getting on top of my physio stuff, doing a little bit of study, and then trying to kind of maintain my fitness, if anything, and picking up the brown ball again. So it's kind of nice in a way, but obviously it can be tough as well at times. Just in Australia in general, we were all a little bit naive to, I suppose, the seriousness of it. I think it was only from chatting to my parents and everything at home and how things had started to progress in Ireland that you realise the schools and everything were shut and sport was brought to a pause as well. That potentially that could happen in Australia as well. So I think us Irish girls had a different perspective on it, whereas the Australian girls were in talks with the AFLPA and AFL to try come to negotiations about finishing the season. But in the back of our heads, I guess, we kind of thought this mightn't even come to fruition at all. The fact that in Ireland things had kind of taken a different turn altogether. So I think we had a little bit of an inkling of what could come down the line. But obviously the AFL is an industry as well, and they would like to keep the games and everything going. So they tried their best, but at the same time, the safety and everything was paramount for everyone. So it came to a pause. But I think things are going quite well in Australia. As well as they can, I suppose. Not that it's a great situation at all, but the numbers and everything are quite low. So I think they've kind of progressed out of lockdown a little bit, and they're looking for the men's season to kind of start kicking off again soon. Obviously, they have to break down a few barriers to get it started and make sure that it is safe. But I think that they're kind of looking towards getting football back, which is great, even just for spectators and everything to for people to have something to watch, I suppose, keep them occupied, and also for the players, because that's what you want to be doing, like out in the thick of it, playing a game, I suppose.
OTB AM. This is OTB Sports Radio.
The OTB Brief. Everything you need to know about sport every morning. Need to get on top of the day's sports news? Well, the OTB Brief is the only sports update you'll need every morning. With all the breaking stories, post-match reaction.
They had one more day to rest. We were really in trouble to build the team.
And the best bits from off the ball, all in a 10-minute podcast.
Oh, sweaty palms. Of course, you guys know what it's like, but that was nervy, yeah.
The OTB Brief, online every morning from 7 a.m. on offtheball.com, the Go Loud app, and everywhere you get your podcasts.
OTB AM. The OTB Culture Hall of Fame.
Brought to you by Now TV. Watch whatever you're in the mood for.
Right, this week's OTB Culture Hall of Fame in association with Now TV is none other than Paul Howard, who has brought the best bookshelf game that we've seen of this entire lockdown so far. This is a power of intimidation akin to something you'd see in a mafia film, Paul.
This is wallpaper, just to let you know. You look really, really careful. You'll see the pattern repeats itself. So people will probably think he's got 6 copies of that book, but no, it's just wallpaper.
Is this your actual work? Is this where you do your writing?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, it's got two walls lined with books, which has another advantage because when I record in here, when I do the weekly podcast, it's soundproof. So I don't need to sort of fiddle around with volumes and all that kind of thing. But yeah, this is my torture chamber.
So you've been working at home essentially for years.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of been, especially the first sort of 4 or 5 months of the year, I'm kind of socially isolating anyway. I'm always, this time of year, I always have a Ross or Carol Kelly book deadline. This year I have we're doing a second Gordon Darcy children's book. And then I have a third book, which I've just finished as well. And that's since the beginning of January. So I wasn't really having much of a life anyway. So I don't have that sort of fear of missing out that I often do, when I'm working.
When are we going to get to find out about the third book? That sounds interesting.
Next year. It's a children's book. It's not sport related at all. It's completely different to anything I've ever done before. It's a kind of fantasy book for children, and just an idea I had a few years back, and I was kind of just looking for time really to do it. I think I came up with the idea about 8 years ago, and just didn't have the time, but then got a bit of time this year, obviously with the lockdown and everything. I'm not missing anything.
How do you find your productivity levels on a general basis, Paul? I think that's something that a lot of people have probably struggled with over the last 2 months or so. Is it possible for you to just sit in that room, that torture chamber, and bash out your best work?
Yeah, I think like a deadline is a great way of concentrating your mind, I think, and I always find that I work quite well. I take deadlines very seriously, I think, because I worked in newspapers for years, and because my first boss was Vincent Brown. It was just, if somebody told you that something had to be ready by, your deadline was 5 o'clock on Thursday, it was 5 o'clock on Thursday. And if you didn't deliver, it wasn't, you might as well not write it because it wasn't going in the paper. So when I started working for myself, when I left sports journalism and started writing books for a living, I tried to maintain the same hours that I did when I was a journalist. So I get up very early in the morning. I'm a morning person. So, you know, like since lockdown, actually since the beginning of January, I've been up most mornings at about 5 o'clock.
Right.
And I do my best work between kind of 5 and lunchtime. And then the afternoon, who knows, you know, if I can bring myself to, I'm usually so tired by then, I can't actually trust anything I've written. Like I read it back the next day and I go, God, who wrote this?
Well, in fairness, that's still a 7-hour shift between 5 and 12. I'm just working the maths out in your head. A lot of people, I'd say, are just kind of rolling out of bed and then actually trying to get cracking on things. And you've already done 7 hours at that point. I'd say you're not beating yourself up too much if there's some afternoons where you're like, can't find the words today.
I remember seeing this great interview with Mike Tyson once, and he was talking about how he used to get up at 4:30 in the morning to run. And they asked him, why do you run at 4:30? And he said, because he found out one of his opponents was getting up at 5. And he felt that he would, I think it was Larry Holmes, that he would have a psychological advantage from being up for half an hour before Larry Holmes. I'm a bit like that as well. We were always like that in our house. We were very much a lark family rather than an owl family. So it's just what's always worked for me. My mind is just fresher at that time of the day.
Is it any coincidence that you found the time to write an idea that you had 8 years ago just as football gets cancelled? Is there anything that's maybe linking these two things in your head at all?
Oh, look, I mean, yeah. I mean, that's completely it. I've nothing to do, you know? Like my dad still rings me on a Saturday and says, did you get the football results? You know, we're still living in this fantasy world that is still going on, you know? And he rings me just to kind of, you know, he likes to remind himself what it feels like to actually discuss football. I mean, definitely, I have a lot more time on my hands now. I think I've there's fewer distractions. You know, I'm not kind of checking websites every 5 minutes to see if Liverpool bought anybody or who's injured or anything like that. You know, sometimes I go on the BBC Sport website and I realize they haven't actually refreshed the page for about 48 hours, you know, or you're reading a feature on it that you were reading 3 days ago. So yeah, there's, you know, I think there's definitely a lot fewer distractions around the place, a lot fewer things to think about.
It does seem very Liverpool that a global pandemic will prevent them from lifting the trophy when they were so far ahead that it was absolutely impossible for them to be caught.
It's very Liverpool, yeah. I started following Liverpool when it was easy to follow Liverpool, you know, like a lot of Liverpool fans of my age, a great many of whom work in the media. We started following them in the 70s when it was just easy, like, you know, winning titles was like having a birthday. If you just hung around long enough, it was on the way. And so the last 30 years, I mean, there's been so many low points. There's been a few kind of false dawns, a few times when you thought, you know, especially under Rafa, when you thought this is the start of something, you know, and yeah, I mean, it's just so bizarre. It's just, there's a woman who works in she's the local postmistress here, and I go into the post office and she's a huge Liverpool fan. Her name is Mary, and when I go in, we always banter about Liverpool, you know. And I went in yesterday, and I was wearing a mask, like, you know, and I was just across here. And I'm so used to wearing the mask now, I've actually forgotten I'm wearing it. And I walked in, and we just kind of mused on the fact that if I'd walked in like that 3 months ago, she would have pressed the panic button. And it's just, you know, between that and then, you know, looking at each other and saying, Liverpool, is it ever going to happen? It's just kind of reinforces just the strangeness of this time we're living through now.
It is totally bizarre. And it's, I guess, like, your job is to be creative. How much of the raw stuff that we read every week, is that written in the moment? Are you filing every week for that? And does that come in the book, or do you write the book?
No, the books are, in the early days, the first few Ross books I wrote, they contained a lot of the material that had been featured in columns, but now they're completely different, you know. In fact, the timelines have run in separate directions. So in the books, Ross had 5 children and in the column for a long time he only had 2 because he'd had these triplets in the book. So I had to keep them separate because I didn't want to give away spoilers in the column. So he had 5 in one and 2 in the other. So I had to, at one point, just sort of slip in the fact into the Irish Times column that he had these triplets in the house. Anyway, I was getting all these messages, like over 100 messages from people saying, triplets? Where the hell did these triplets come from? But I'd had to get them in somehow because I just couldn't ignore the fact that he had them. But the columns, I try to keep them current, and I suppose at the moment I can't write about anything other than the lockdown. I can't have Ross out there in the world, or Charles out there in the world. So they're all stuck in this little house on the Vico Road. Well, this huge house on the Vico Road in Killiney, and they're isolating there. So for the last sort of 8 weeks, the column has been just about trying to survive each other, really, and it's a challenge. It is a challenge as a writer that, you've just got one location and you've got these sort of 7 characters, 8 characters sharing the same space. And it's the challenge, I suppose, of keeping it interesting, finding something new to write about every week.
I guess it gives you a good theme, and I'm not sure if it helps or not, actually, but it is certainly a theme to focus on every week. And I wonder if writing and comedy writing in general is just going to have a swathe of brilliant coronavirus content when this is over. But now that you say it, it's probably happening right now.
It's really difficult with something like this because you just have to be really careful about, about deciding what your targets are, or where the comedy is, where the jokes are, where the punchlines are, because you have to sort of, you have to keep remembering that, it's really, really serious, and, people are struggling with it, with the disease, and then also with the financial effects of it as well. And we have no idea what they're going to be, what a blow it's going to be to the economy. We have some idea, but no idea how great it's going to be. So I suppose during writing comedy at times like this, you're always a lot more tentative, I think. I agonize over every line a lot more than I would ordinarily. And I read it back, and I try to imagine, right, if I'm reading this, how does this read? But it's difficult. It is always difficult at a time like this to be standing up telling jokes, I think.
Or talking about football, or talking about, matches that happened 25 years ago in a way. But I guess you also feel a responsibility to be that 10 minutes of distraction when people flick to that page in the magazine, that it is something that they're going to enjoy and will at the same time reflect what the world is happening in the world, but take them out of it in some way as well.
Yeah, and that's it. I mean, it is light entertainment, and I know what you mean. There's, if you go on social media and talk about anything other than COVID-19 at the moment, you're always going to get people who say, "How can you talk about X when Y is happening?" And that's just, I suppose, the nature of social media. It's the nature of the human condition as well. But yeah, I mean, I what I do is, what I write is satire. So while trying to remain funny, I also try to sort of reflect something of what's going on at the time, and maybe some of the madness of the time as well.
Let's get into that, because the whole point of the OTB Culture Hall of Fame is that we ask people to bring something that's going to go into it. And I just want to remind everybody that is in association with Now TV. You can stream every episode of the unmissable new show Gangs of London on the Now TV Entertainment Pass. An Irish boss, Colm, a leading gang member across all of London, is assassinated, leaving his son to keep his family and the business together. A 14-day free trial is available now. It stars Colm and Joe Cole, who was on the show last week and put City of God into the OTB Culture Hall of Fame, which is a brilliant movie. I suspect your character from this week would be able to solve the conundrum at the heart of Gangs of London if he just put his mind to it. You want to put Columbo into the Culture Hall of Fame?
Oh yeah. Columbo, to me, it's the greatest TV show ever made, and I know it's pushing on for 40 years now since the first episode. But actually, it's pushing on for 50 years since the first episode. But I think it's one of those TV shows that still holds up. It's completely different to any other crime drama that went before or has come since, in that the format is totally inverted. It's not a whodunit. William Link and Richard Levison, who wrote it, said it was a how catch 'em instead of a whodunit. So you found out in the very, very first scene who the killer was, why he did it, and how he did it. And so you know more than the detective inside the first 5 minutes. And the show is essentially how this character Columbo picks apart the story every week, how he solves the crime. And it's all kind of old-fashioned police work, you know. So there's no, like, it's never kind of, you know, DNA, or you never hear him say like we'll get a DNA match on that. Like, he catches the killer out in a lie, and his powers of observation. The great thing about Columbo is he's very unlike any other detective in that he's really, really scatterbrained. And it feels weird me explaining who Columbo is to people, but I realize there are a lot of people, even people over the age of 30, who aren't really familiar with the show. But he's this sort of shambling detective. He's a lieutenant in the LAPD, in the homicide division. And he wears this kind of raincoat, this dirty beige raincoat, these sort of high top brogues, we would call them, in this sweltering LA weather, you know. He always has this little cigar, this little stogie between his fingers, and this ash dropping off the end of it. And he walks into a crime scene and he's spilling ash everywhere. And, you know, he takes out his notebook and he discovers he's got his wife's shopping list is written in his police notebook. And he said, I must get that later on. And he always meets the murderer. The first person he meets when he gets to the scene it's generally the murderer. And he knows almost immediately, this is the guy who did it. And the show is essentially how he psychologically picks them apart. So he has all of these tricks that he uses to do that. So just to sort of wrong foot people, he pretends to be really forgetful. Quite often the murderer is somebody who's quite famous. So there'll be an author or a famous composer or an actor, because it's set in mostly Hollywood. And he would just break off from a conversation with the killer to say, my wife is your biggest fan. My wife absolutely loves your stuff. And then he kind of leads the killer along by telling him, you know, I need your big brain to help me solve this crime. And the killer is generally flattered and thinks this guy's an idiot, so I can kind of control the way the investigation goes. But Columbo is always too clever, you know. And he has this great device, and it kind of became his catchphrase. He leaves a room. He says something really unsettling to the killer, and then he leaves the room. And then when the killer looks really worried, he comes back in and says, just one more thing. And just one more thing is usually something really anodyne, like that wasn't relevant at all. But it's just to kind of just to unsettle the guy.
Is it funny? Is it supposed to be funny along the way?
Yeah, I mean, there's some of the later ones that Peter Falk made for ABC. He kind of hammed it up a little bit, you know. He's a funny character, but I think in those the golden period for Columbo was kind of 71 to 78, which was when it was on NBC, and they were absolutely brilliant. Later on, it became a little bit hallmarky, and the catchphrases became kind of the thing, you know, and it was a little bit hammy. But it's absolutely hilarious because you realize the stakes are so serious, and he stresses the killer out. I mean, basically, in almost every single episode, at the very end, when Columbo solves the case and essentially just does his ta-da moment, which is, you know, this is how I've solved it, the killer willfully kind of holds up his wrists and says, put the bracelets on, and happily goes off to the electric chair, I presume, because Columbo has so defeated him psychologically. So what classically happens is, I said a second ago that Columbo, he flatters them and tells them, you know, my wife loves you and all this kind of, will you sign this book for my wife? And then there comes a point in the investigation where he keeps presenting his theories. And then there comes a point when the killer says, "Oh, Lieutenant Columbo, you really are a preposterous man." And then about 20 minutes later, it turns into this rage, like where he's saying, you know, "Get out, Lieutenant," and sort of throws him out of the house. And then, you know, the next time they meet is going to be the end game.
It's incredible that for a television show that ran for 32 years, it's got an IMDb rating of 8.2. Like, surely at some point over the 32 years, the rating would slip. And as you say, even between different broadcast companies, different writers, you would imagine that the standards would slip, but not for Columbo. Like, is this something that you remember watching from as young as you can remember? And is it something that through the decades was part of your life?
No, I'd say I discovered it quite late.
Right.
When the first season, first sort of 7 or 8 seasons, well, I was kind of like 5 or 6, so I was too young to watch it. But in the late 80s, ABC bought the rights and started making new ones. And that was the time when RTE got a hold of all the old ones and started showing them. So I was probably about 17 when I discovered it. I think the reason it's got that rating is because it's pure storytelling. Like, there's no gimmicks in Columbo. It's not, you know, there's no kind of, you know, there's no fight sequences. There's no difficult arrests. There's no, I don't even remember, there aren't many kind of police sirens, like, you know, going off. It's purely police procedural stuff. And it's kind of just great storytelling, great writing. I think that's why it's kind of survived, like why it sort of measures up against, you know, some of the later cop dramas, and it's the cleverness of how he actually solves the crimes.
How important is Peter Falk in all this? Is it possible to get anywhere near the reverence for this television show without him?
No, I mean he really is Columbo. There was a story I read somewhere that Bing Crosby was originally considered for the role, which would be very, very strange indeed. But you just can't separate Columbo from the character, so much so that when you see Peter Falk in anything else, it looks odd. You know, you kind of expect him to go back into character any minute, and you forget that Peter Falk was a really successful actor before he became Columbo. He had 2 Oscar nominations for gangster movies. He was always in gangster movies because he looked so rough. He only had one eye. One of his eyes was prosthetic. He had cancer of the eye as a child, and the eye was removed when he was 3 years old. So he could never get romantic leads because he had one eye. So he was always cast as gangsters. He played this kind of Che Guevara type character in a movie as well, but mostly it was kind of hoodlums. And then the Columbo thing came along. But I've seen him in other things, and I just can't accept him in anything else. He's just so strong in that role.
It's definitely something that becomes a kind of, I don't want to say cultural moment, but like a lot of people queue up to be in this, and it's got some famous alumni as directors as well. Steven Spielberg did an episode, for example.
Yeah, Steven Spielberg did. I think it was the first non-pilot episode, and it was fantastic. It's actually my favorite episode. It's the first non-pilot episode shown on television, and it's about these 2 authors, and they write these crime books together. And one of them has decided he wants to break up the partnership and wants to go it alone. So the other author lures him to this cabin in the woods where they're going to celebrate with a weekend of hunting. And he kills him. And he thinks he's committed the perfect crime because he's put all this work into it. And Columbo arrives on the scene, and he knows instantly that this guy did it. And he just sort of picks him apart. The other great thing about Columbo, because I realize I'm telling you the entire plot here, it's perfect for me because my nickname at home is Spoiler Alert, because I ruin absolutely everything. Like I ruined Shutter Island. I ruined, all of these movies that have a big reveal at the end. I'm the one in the cinema who shouts out, "That's so sick." Do you know who was great as Kaiser Sose in that movie? I ruin everything. The great thing about Columbo is you can't ruin it because everybody knows who did it right from the start. Frankie Boyle has this funny line in his one of his stand-up routines where he talks about his grandmother watching Columbo, and an hour in she says, "I think I know who did it."
It's far more difficult to do and to make that gripping, isn't it? Like as you say, the device of, say, a fight scene, or even the quest of tracking someone down or finding out who did it is far easier. Like I'm not shooting down that form of television whatsoever, because when that's done, it's exceptional as well. But this is definitely a greater achievement. I think it's almost like in Cold Blood when Truman tells you exactly who's done it, and you just want to figure out why.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the tension around it as well. And one of the other great things about Columbo was that the killer wasn't always an unsympathetic character. And I think most crime dramas you watch now, you know, you're supposed to hate the killer. And quite often you actually like the killer in Columbo because they've killed, you know, from the opening sequence that maybe they're being blackmailed, or they've got this, problem in their life, or there's all sorts of reasons why people kill, and they go through the whole gamut in Columbo. But sometimes he really, really likes the killer. And there's a great episode. There's a character in it called Abigail Mitchell, and she's also a writer, as it happens. And she kills her son-in-law because she suspects that he killed her missing daughter years earlier. Columbo gets to really like her, and they become great friends, but he's still trying to break her down. And there's a lovely moment in it where she says to him, I think you and I have become really good friends. And he says, but don't count on it. It's just such an amazing moment, and she's just left with her mouth open because it's the first moment when she realizes that he knows she did it. But it's always, like I said, there's no chases or anything like that. There's no fight scenes, but it doesn't mean there's no tension. Like there's a great scene in one episode where Columbo realizes the killer is a cigar smoker, and he tells the suspect, his lead suspect, who he's still kind of befriended at this stage, and the friend is smoking the cigar, and he said, I believe the killer is a cigar smoker. And this guy still has the cigar between his fingers, and he said, why do you say that? And he said, the night the body was discovered, there was a match in the ashtray, and the match was burned right down to kind of like this much. And he said, if it was a cigarette smoker, it would just be there. And of course, your man has the cigar in his burning between his fingers. So there was always great moments of tension. You don't need a fight sequence or 30 cars destroyed in a chase to actually have tension in a cop drama.
And I've just checked, it's on YouTube. The official Columbo channel has put up Murder by the Book season 1 episode 1 has over 2 million views, 2.2 million views. So you can dig this out if you want to go looking for it. It's not that hard to find. Yeah. Oh, they're great. There's an Irish one actually that's kind of worth looking at. I think it's called, oh God, it'll come to me in a second. I can't remember at the moment, but it's shockingly bad, because it's a kind of American 1970s representation of Ireland. But The Conspirators, it's called. That's it. The Conspirators. He's an IRA gun runner, the killer, and he kills an arms dealer. And it's kind of strange just to see, he keeps talking about the old country, and he keeps breaking into song. Anytime he's drinking whiskey, he sings God save Ireland, said the hero. It gives us the full on the whether on the gallows high or the battlefield we die, the full God save Ireland. So it's really naff, but it's just a great example of kind of television at that time as well. There's it's kind of funny caricature, but what's great about that particular episode is how Columbo solves that crime. It's one of the best
of any of the episodes. So it doesn't matter, even if at any point the characterization was weak or the script was weak, the procedure stuff saved every episode.
But I will say that you didn't reveal how it got solved there, so you're not living up to your spoiler alert nickname.
I would like to encourage people to watch them.
Paul, we've kind of buried the lead here a small bit. You have paid your respect at Peter Falk's grave. You're that big a fan of Columbo.
Yeah, I did actually. Yeah, I went. His coat is in the Smithsonian in Washington, and I went to see his coat when I was there for the Mike Tyson Kevin McBride fight about 15 years ago, and I was more excited about seeing the coat than I was the fight, but it just happened to be closed the day I went, so I never got to see it. But Mary and we were in Los Angeles about 3 years ago, and he's buried in the cemetery in Westwood in Los Angeles, and it's right in the middle of this really kind of built up area. There's this tiny little cemetery behind an office building, and he's buried in there. And another great hero of mine, Roy Orbison, is buried in there as well. So I wanted to go and pay my respects at his grave. But I found out there's lots of famous people buried there, including Marilyn Monroe. And Joe DiMaggio, in his will, left money for fresh flowers to be put on her grave every day for eternity. And,
wow!
And we saw the flowers being put there while we were standing around, like looking at Columbo's grave. It was a pretty amazing place.
Jesus, that really
what
is
a great contract for a florist. Yeah, I mean,
there must surely be a day in like 1,000 years when the money runs out, but who knows?
Or whoever the investor is. Billy Connolly was in an episode, and a bunch of other actors kind of queued up to be in it. It was like an event for your career to be in an episode.
Yeah,
it reached that kind of level.
Yeah, some of them worked and some of them didn't work. Actually, Billy Connolly was one of the ones that didn't work. He was, and I think he was too big as Billy Connolly. You were too aware of the fact that he's this hilarious Scottish comedian who usually only has to speak for me to laugh. And he was just being particularly unfunny. He didn't have any funny lines in it. So it was, so that one didn't work. But Leonard Nimoy was in the very first pilot episode, and he plays this surgeon who murders his master by, he performs heart surgery on him, and he uses dissolving sutures. And it's a brilliant episode. And the chemistry, the hatred between Columbo and this doctor character, the surgeon character, it's really, really sparky. It's the only episode, I think, where Columbo actually loses his temper, because he's just kind of one mood the whole time. But it's the only time he actually shouts. He shouts at one of the killers and loses his rag. Johnny Cash is in one episode, and it's one of the best as well. He plays this Bible thumping preacher, singer type, and himself essentially. And he kills. I'm sorry, I'm spoiling it. Okay, but he kills his ex-wife and manager who is bribing him, and he's trying to get away from him. He wants to go off and do other kinds of music, and he kills her in this really kind of inventive way. They go up in a plane, and he arranges for the plane to crash by fiddling with the engine, and he jumps out in a parachute and leaves the plane to crash, and he pretends he's kind of survived in the wreckage, and Columbo smells a rat straight away. But that's one of the great episodes, and that's one of the examples of, an established star who comes in and it's just really good. And you actually forget he's Johnny Cash, or you don't care that he's Johnny Cash because he's such a great character in it.
It's funny how some TV programs can work with the big stars and some can't. And I guess if you have 60 odd episodes, there are going to be some duds in there, but it's great to have the good ones. So you mentioned Leonard Nimoy, obviously was William Shatner, Vincent Price, Martin Sheen.
Yeah. Ray Milland. Anyone who was anyone. I think there's something like 4 or 5 Oscar winners have appeared as villains in it after winning Oscars. So right. It was, they all wanted to do it, and that wasn't the way it was at the time. Now all Hollywood stars want to do television, but it wasn't like that at the time. So, you know, the show, it just shows you how, you know, what an impact it had on people, you know. And this was back in the day when it was real go-to TV. You know, there was a sense that everybody sat down and watched the latest episode of Columbo. Yeah, everybody, absolutely everybody wants to be in it.
I guess we forget about that, really. That whole, you know, we can all, quick Google, you find it on YouTube. That first episode is there. 2 million people have watched it in the last 2 years, and that's just on one platform. It's probably loads of other different places as well. But you do forget that these series, so much money went into them. There was only 3 or 4 that each of the TV companies made, which meant that there wasn't that much choice every year. So it had to be good for it to survive, and it had to have some kind of support from the public as well.
Yeah. I mean, like to tell you how big it was, like it made, you know, Columbo was on the cover of Time magazine. I actually have the picture here.
Oh wow!
Can you see that? Is there a shine on it?
TV's Year of the Cop.
So it was absolutely huge. This is hanging in my bathroom, but visitors to the house think it's very strange. They have you got Columbo hanging in your bathroom. I have to explain it to them.
Just one more thing, and literally just one more thing. Not only about going to see his grave, but you've got his dog as well.
Yeah, he's here. The only problem, Humphrey is his name. He's a basset hound. Humphrey, come here. The only problem with basset hounds is they never do what they're told. And this was what kind of drew me to Columbo, to a basset hound, that Columbo had one, and it was called Dog, and it never, ever did anything. He had to carry it everywhere. Like, you know, they're huge. This dog is 30 kilos. And Columbo takes it to the vet regularly, you know, and he just won't do anything. He just sits there. He won't do anything. And I just thought, that's the dog for me. That's what I want. I want this lazy dog who refuses to move. But anyway, it turned out he wasn't like that at all. Like, he's got tons of energy, and you're just constantly fighting with him as well, you know. But it was purely down to Columbo. It just, I think he might be coming in. No. I'd send you a picture.
Perfect. That was the perfect finale there, where he doesn't do what he's told and doesn't do what he's told.
Ever. No, there's some treats here. I'm trying to kind of, I've got a sort of Hansel and Gretel type trail of treats coming over here to try and get him. Here, Humphrey, come here. Here. Hang on. I'll move this slightly.
Oh.
No. Oh, he's just shy.
The big reveal. All right, he's camera shy. Paul, you've been great. This is exactly what we wanted for this week's OTB Culture Hall of Fame with Now TV. Columbo, it's 100% going in, and we'll get people to dig that out on YouTube. Paul Howard, you're a gent. Thanks very much. A reminder, of course, you can stream every episode of the unmissable new show Gangs of London on the Now TV Entertainment Pass. An Irish boss, Colm, a leading gang member across all of London, is assassinated, leaving his son to keep his family and the business together. You can a 14-day free trial if you want it, starring Colm and Joe Cole, who was last week's guest on the show. Recommend you dig that out as well. We'll take a quick break, back after these.
The OTB Culture Hall of Fame.
Brought to you by Now TV. Watch whatever you're in the mood for.
Okay, so delighted to say that Chuck Mindenhall of The Athletic and the Man and the Myth podcast is with us now to discuss UFC 249. Chuck, you're very welcome back to the show. Great to have you. How are you getting on?
Great, man. It's been too long, fellas. Come on.
It sure has. I guess I just want to ask how Saturday night was for you, because I certainly think that a lot of people who were watching UFC 249 on the night are, I want to say, pleasantly surprised with the product that they got and how satisfying the whole thing was. I'm not sure what we were expecting, but turns out having an empty arena actually doesn't translate that poorly to us sitting at home watching it on television.
Yeah, that was kind of the revelation for me as well. You know, I mean, honestly, man, like it enhanced actually the sound and the effect of the violence that you're watching. And I hate to say it just like that, but it felt to me like you were watching something in close proximity, because you could hear every exchange, and you could actually hear the corners. You could hear things going on in the atmosphere in the arena. And also, like, the thing that was kind of slept on was, these guys, they weren't steered in any direction trying to play up to a crowd. They weren't hearing boos or cheers or feeding off of that in any way, which translated into kind of this more sincere moment when they got to the microphone and they would talk about whatever just happened. I felt like it was way more authentic expression of what they would normally say under circumstances like this. So I felt like there was all kinds of novel things going on there. And about me too, man. I was pleasantly surprised with the whole presentation, actually.
It turns out that it was a fully better audio experience. I thought, like, the connection of each hit was definitely more telling. It was more educating. You knew a little bit more of what was happening, the severity of each hit. Like, you almost didn't need the commentators to tell you. Like, of course, it always helps when they're adding a bit of energy into your ears and all that. It's fantastic. But I find previously you almost need Joe Rogan to be shouting for you to realize just how severe a hit was. On Saturday night, you could hear the connections yourself and make your own mind up.
Yeah, it's almost like the subtle difference between I don't know, like having a almost internal experience with it. Like, you watch it, and I said to a different buddy of mine, I was like, it was like if a fight broke out at a locker in school next to you, and you could hear every punch, and you feel it. You feel the wind and all this. I was like, that's what it kind of felt like to me, man. It brings it home because I think you build up your immunity a little bit to what's happening, what you're watching sometimes. So you see some blood or you see somebody's arm getting torn off. You're like, this is just part of the game. But when you kind of have all of your senses focused on one place, including your hearing and all of that, there's a lot more that rings home. When you're watching that, it becomes more of a profound experience again. I think part of that too, though, is 2 months away, without basically seeing a fight card. I think that might have played into it too, just having, an event to watch like that.
I will say there was, sorry, Joe, just one last point before you come in.
Yeah.
There is a definitely comic value to Bruce Buffer in an empty arena.
Yeah. Anything where they would typically play up to a crowd, right? Like, you're like, well, now we're doing charades, but I guess you're still looking at an audience at home, so it's okay. But yeah, so the Bruce Buffer stuff was good. There was a lot of just unique things, just the fact that certain fighters were hearing Daniel Cormier's commentary and actually taking that as advice and using and executing, like Carla Esparza and Greg Hardy, I think both said they did that. Things like that, man. I mean, I just never anticipated we'd see so many kind of strange features from a telecast like that.
Yeah, special shout outs to whatever producer or director was like throwing those wide shots where you normally get the crowd going crazy during the introduction. That's just this empty arena. You wrote a great piece last week speaking about how the fact this is kind of like a sci-fi dystopian future come to life, that we're all kind of huddled up at home watching fighters smuggled from all over the country fighting in this empty arena. The President of the United States starting the telecasts wasn't part of your predictions.
No, but that only adds to the rogue vibe of what was going on, doesn't it? It's like he's not exactly the most popular figure over here. So it's like it seemed like it was almost it only just kind of added to the bootleg feel of what was going on. It's a bizarre setup, but once you kind of accept it, honestly, and kind of let your mind work over it the way that they are intending and try to give it, keep an open mind on it. I thought it played out as well as it possibly could. Obviously, Jacare and his cornermen getting it. I thought at the time, I was like, this could be disastrous, but I thought the UFC kind of showed that you can, even have an incident like that and still carry on with the event and everything else. So, I mean, the whole thing carried a bootleg feel, but I got to say, man, I'm a bit of a guy who appreciates things like that on some level too, because that's why you get drawn to the fight game. There's a lot of weirdness that goes on, and this was just another weird chapter, man, and that we just started into, and I thought it came off pretty well, honestly.
How important? Sorry, go on, Joe.
Sorry, just when you mentioned it there, just the positive test. When you first heard about the 3 positive tests, what were your initial thoughts? Like, I know because since the card had previously been pulled under some pressure from kind of Disney/ESPN. When I first thought, I was thinking kind of, is there going to be take 2 here? Are there going to be cold feet? Then obviously once it's come off, it's kind of been a bit normalized, but I just wondering what your initial thoughts were when you heard that news.
So my initial thoughts, man, and again, we're dealing with this in real time, and the UFC is dealing with it and by trial and error, right? But like you're dealing with it in real time. You hear something like this, you think it's the ultimate backfire. You think like, oh man, and you kind of go down the channels of what you've been hearing, which is just how much exposure was there between Jacare and everybody else, between his cornermen and everyone else. So my initial thing was, this is the ultimate backfire. This is the worst kind of news, and you're kind of bracing for it to even get worse. But if anything, and I don't know how it'll play out, because obviously, like, we're still in the midst of kind of figuring out everything about that. If anything, it kind of maybe showed people from the rest of the world, like the rest of the sports world anyway, like, hey, you can even have a positive result and still keep rolling if you just handle it correctly. UFC, obviously, I don't think they handled everything perfectly correct, but they showed that it can be done, and I think they'll learn from that situation too. At least we'd hope they'd learn from a situation like that. But honestly, my initial thought was, this is a backfire, brace for maybe the worst, which might even end up in the cancellation of the card. That was my initial thought.
It didn't come close to that, did it? Like, obviously, you had a situation where Dana White was fist bumping him, and like, I guess we're only a couple of days after the event as well. Like, there is still the possibility of there to be a result of this result down the line. Unfortunately, hopefully nothing does happen, but it certainly raised a few eyebrows, not just because of the positive test, but also because of the footage of the fist bump.
Yeah, all of that. And even during the fights, man, Joe Rogan shaking hands with everybody. Yeah. I mean, it was just, the whole thing was just it's kind of surreal in that way. I don't know, man. I feel like the UFC is learning on the fly on how to deal with this. And there's a part of you, an adventurous spirit type of thing, says, hey, good for them for trying to go out there and actually, they're going to be criticized for trying this and for some of the failures, like for instance, with I guess if you look at the Jacare and all of that as a failure, they're going to go through that and be scrutinized for it. And we see how they respond. Obviously, they're running 3 events this week, and it's got all kinds of potential for disaster, man, through this whole thing in one arena and everything. And we'll see how it all goes. Maybe this would be the thing you look at again in a couple of weeks, and you try to figure out at that point, like, how did it really come off? But as of right now, I feel like they've been handling themselves, decently for the first sports party to go forward like this.
Well, like, I think there's kind of 2 ways of looking at it, Chuck. I think on the one hand, you can say, and like, I think, to be honest with you, even Donald Trump mentioned this in his video about the idea of getting our sports back. And, there is a big sort of chest thumping, patriotic tone to it. But in the actual, what he is saying, we want our sports back. Nobody disagrees with that. We all want to get our sports back around the world. There are positive mental health benefits to that. It's what we love. It's what the athletes love. Nobody will disagree with that. But then at the same time, there has been a bit of the chest thumping element to it. And I wonder if even the idea of Joe Rogan hopping into the octagon to do those interviews, when I'd read on ESPN on Friday that those were going to be done socially distanced and stuff like that, it just felt like the UFC were constantly pushing the boat out to say, look at us and screw your COVID-19, screw your social distancing policies. We're going to be able to do this the way we want to do it. That I agree in the main part that the meat on the bone feels right, but there is just a few things hanging around the edge here which don't sit fully well with me.
No, I'm with you 100% on that. And you could go through the psychology of the reasons for this a lot of time. But I mean, this is the decree, right? Like, you keep socially distanced. I think that this is a collective thing globally. Like, you have to kind of adhere to it. For anybody to kind of mock it or, like, make people feel like maybe, you know what I mean? Like that they understand it a little better, or they're not scared by it, things like that. I'm like, it just seems unnecessary, man. It seems unnecessary. I saw Joe Rogan doing that, and not just Joe. I mean, there are you're seeing like other examples of it kind of sprinkled around the event itself. But I'm like, I prefer that they kind of corrected that. That leaves themselves open to criticisms that they really don't need. The bigger issue is obviously like to keep the fighters safe, right? And I just don't think you need to fly in the face of all that fear and possibility when you don't have to. And I'd be a little surprised if they keep doing it. I mean, if it looks exactly the same, I'd be a little surprised. I just think that that kind of thing is bad optics for anybody who's actually adhering to kind of the restrictions right now in our world. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and in terms of the general kind of court of public opinion, the show seems to have been a success. We're seeing reports say of 700,000 buys, which, given the new mechanism through ESPN Plus, that's a big number. And also given the state of the economy with the hit that it's taken from the pandemic.
Yeah, that's a big number, man. And you know what the truth is, I wasn't sure. I was just given the economy the way it is, I wondered if we would see those kinds of numbers. Not just that, like, you know, like there's so many places that show the fights publicly that are shut down right now. I almost, my hunch was actually it'd be lower numbers than we were anticipating. So that's a good thing. And I got to say, man, like, I don't know about you guys, but I always kind of gauge, you know, like the interest in something like this by the amount of people you hear from who don't normally watch it. And I felt like I was hearing from a lot of people. I do know a lot of gambling degenerates and things like that too. So they were wanting advice and all this, but I was hearing from people that you're like, man, these guys don't usually watch the fights, and they were watching them. So I guess in that way, it speaks to you on a very basic level. But in the end, I wasn't surprised, just given the interaction on Saturday night, social media, and then my own private talking to people who don't watch it. I thought maybe at that point it was going to do better than we anticipated, or than I anticipated. And yeah, man, that number is pretty impressive, actually.
Like being the first sport back, it was always going to be a key thing. And I guess the truly global reach that the UFC has as well definitely helps it. It's always been, I felt, a sport that had tapped into the online market ahead of everybody else. So, and I guess that goes back to the history of perhaps it not being a mainstream sport and having to find other avenues. Maybe that is the culture of the UFC at its best now, finding ways to actually make the sport happen.
Yeah, 100%, man. And I agree with you. I feel like just the online presence, but also the social media presence. Like I felt like, I don't know how you guys felt, but on social media, it felt like a party. You know, it's like everybody was showing up, everybody was chiming in. You know, actors, celebrities, other sports stars. Everybody seemed to be watching it and kind of adding to this this collective experience. And the UFC at its very, very best is able to accomplish that. I think that when they can get all of you know, everybody kind of watching, and I say it like this because I know this is what they want, but like you know, they achieve a kind of like positive energy over the whole thing, where you know, everybody's just anticipating the next fight while other people are still cooing about the last fight. I feel like when you get that kind of atmosphere, it makes the event seem so much bigger in scope than just your normal one. And I thought that this one had the feel of that. And I do think it's because, you know, so many people are on social media and so many people are doing that. But for one night, it was almost like the old UFC pay-per-views where it was an event because they're spread out so far and everybody paid attention to the event based on that. 2 months is all it took. It was like coming back from an off season, and it had that feel to me a little bit.
Maybe just in terms of people who wouldn't be following it as closely, in terms of both the kind of the depth of the card, the magnitude of those fights, the stakes, and then also it wasn't just the stakes, though. They're all fan-friendly fights that came through. There were no one was grinding it out, no one was really running away. Every fight just, like from the first fight on, was just fireworks.
Yeah, and it was like, even on the prelims, man, honestly, I was trying to think, was there even a dud on the card? I mean, it seemed like every fight had something to it, and it had something in prospect, too. When you were thinking about the matchups, a lot of them were very intriguing. You know, the Dominic Cruz-Henry Cejudo fight, to me, it's like it was completely underplayed because, in general, you have a guy coming back from 3.5 years away who's kind of still the face of the bantamweight division, considered the GOAT, against the guy who's the new guy, you know, and coming in. And to me, that was fascinating. But you almost couldn't wrap your mind around it because there was so much depth to the card. There's so much other stuff to look at and all that. So I was vastly intrigued and in prospect, like coming in. And I thought all of those fights, for the most part, either paid off or exceeded expectations. So again, man, it's like I'm not sure the UFC could have asked for a better return. And you know, if the card was a dud, maybe we're criticizing it for some of the other stuff as well, like right now as well. But the truth was, it felt worth it, didn't it? It felt worth it for the risk because all those fights paid off.
What happens next, Chuck, in terms of this week and in terms of beyond this week? Because like there's been some wild ideas out there for how the UFC maintains this level of activity in the COVID world.
I think that's the big question. Obviously, Wednesday night, there's another fight card, which is more, you know, par for the course of what you would see on a typical fight night. It's not the greatest card, but it's not bad. There's some good names all over it. The matchups are just, you know, they're pretty good. I think that once we get rolling again, we'll see. But this is a strange time, right? Like, I feel like if you relax on what's going on, disaster could boom, to any of these events. So I feel like even though the cards may, some of these cards may sag in terms of their intrigue, the UFC has to kind of ratchet it up and meet it on a level that's taking it even more and more serious as they go, because they have to figure out how to do this as cleanly as possible, right? Like, so I feel like we're going to see a lot of that, like some trial and error over the next couple weeks anyway. And hopefully, man, like as a fan of the sport and as a guy who covers it and who knows so many people within this industry, you hope that it all comes off and, they don't have any big problems that become a bigger black eye on the sport than it needs to be. I just think that it was a nice first step. There were some missteps there, but I feel like it was a nice first step back into action. And honestly, man, this is the one time where I'm like, I really don't know, but you're vastly intriguing. You're rooting for the UFC to do it safely and successfully, I guess, at this point.
And just kind of speaking of the road forward and maybe the potential for disaster or embarrassment, is Fight Island going to happen, or is it more realistic that they get back to the Apex in Vegas or something like that before the Fight Island's needed?
Well, it feels to me, and this is the weird effect of this, like the way that this works, because I don't know what you guys are hearing over there, but it's almost like I see Major League Baseball suddenly is hatching a plan for an 82-game season. I feel like the UFC was a catalyst for people to kind of start realistically looking at getting back. So they may have helped their own cause in terms of that. I think that the Apex probably, the NFL over here too is also like functioning as if it's going to go forward. I think that the Apex probably becomes the more realistic option. But man, I'm somewhat of a, like I said before, I like the weird elements and the fringe elements of the fight game. So I would love to see, from a personal standpoint, how this Fight Island would play out, man. I would really love to see it. I don't know how realistic it is. It seems crazy to me because I'm like, there's so many logistical problems that you could go down. But as just a guy who likes that kind of chaos and kookiness, man, I would love to personally see it. I don't know how realistic it is, though, man.
It sounds like a horror movie meets a reality TV show, but like who needs Fight Islands when you have Florida, basically? So long may it continue for fight fans, I guess, the UFC. Just on a final point, Chuck, as somebody who writes and covers combat sports, how has it been for you over the last couple of weeks? I'd imagine just having UFC and having this huge part of your career back in a regularized place is big for you personally.
It is. It feels, it's good to have it back. It feels like you have a more certain idea of what's going to happen in your future. So far, the Athletic has been amazing, man. Like they were kind of built to, subscription based and what they've been able to do. I feel like that they were kind of built for this type of thing, because you hear of some furloughs and some jobs and being lost and everything else within our industry. For us, it's been okay. Like there has not been a threat of that. And if I take a silver lining from this last, few weeks, it's been that it's the rare opportunity to look backwards, at things that have happened and kind of give some people their due, revisit some things that you never had time to do because they were the ceaseless nature of the schedule. I feel like it's been nice on that level, man, just to be able to go back, kind of write some pieces of retrospective pieces or things kind of commemorating events or anniversaries of things that happened, and just bringing back up the past a little bit, bringing the kind of gravity of what's happened and some of those names that get forgotten, bringing them back into the conversation. I think we all looked at it a little bit like that, and we were able to kind of persevere through it. But honestly, man, there's nothing like a fight plays out in hype, right? Like you're thinking about the fight coming up. It's easier to do it that way. It's more exhilarating to think of that way. And it's nice to have it back that way because it's more fun to talk about what's about to happen than what has already happened.
Listen, it's been amazing actually having something to look at for a prolonged period of time where you don't know the results, where there's actually a little bit of suspense. And actually, that was definitely the most satisfying thing about what happened last weekend. Listen, Chuck Mindenhall, it's been great having you back on the show. Thanks a million for taking the call and stay safe.
Of course, fellas. You too. Thank you.
OTB AM. This is OTB Sports Radio.